Section 1. The World Behind the Curtain. There is something quietly fascinating about the idea that the shows we grew up watching, the ones that felt so permanent and so present in our living rooms, so woven into the fabric of late nights and Sunday evenings and the background noise of entire childhoods, were hiding entire worlds behind them. Rooms full of content that got written, animated, recorded, sometimes fully completed at enormous expense and effort, and then quietly pulled away before anyone could see it. Locked in a vault, buried in a legal file, scrubbed from a streaming platform without an announcement, without a note, without any indication to the audience that anything was gone, just absent, as if it had never been made at all, as if the thousands of hours of creative work and production labor that went into it had simply dissolved back into the air when the decision came down from whoever happened to be in charge of decisions that particular week. Family Guy is one of the most richly documented cases of this phenomenon in the history of American television. And I do not mean that in the casual sense of every long-running show having an occasional deleted scene here or there, or the standard practice of every television production cutting material for time in the editing room. The history of what Family Guy was not allowed to show you is almost as long and almost as detailed as the history of what it was. There are full episodes complete, finished, fully produced, fully voiced and scored and animated that never touched American airwaves. Episodes that were made, that went through the entire production process all the way to a finished product, and were then locked away before the broadcast window ever opened. There are scenes that were completed frame by the animation studios, voiced by the full cast in the recording booth, scored with original music, mixed, color-corrected, reviewed by the production team, and then quietly removed from the episode before it reached a living room television screen. There are jokes that aired exactly once during an original broadcast and were then stripped from every subsequent rerun, every DVD release, every streaming version that followed. There are entire sequences that lived briefly in the world and were then recalled from it, treated as if they had never been permitted to exist. And then there are the pieces of content that existed in even stranger forms, things that were never intended for public consumption but that escaped into the world anyway. Things that were cut so late in production they made it into some copies of a DVD that had already been pressed and shipped, and not into the version that went through quality control and caught the problem. Alternate takes of scenes you may have watched 100 times that exist somewhere in the studio's archive, with dialogue that goes further, or different, and more pointed, or more explicit, or more committed to something the broadcast version could not fully commit to. The musical numbers that were finished and voiced and scored and animated, and then deemed too long or too risky or too committed to a joke that the network did not want to have to explain to a congressional oversight committee. The stories that were written and then revised, the characters who said things they could not say, the comedic moments that were completed and locked in a cabinet while something safer took their place on screen. Family Guy has been a presence on American television since the 31st of January 1999. That is more than 25 years of production history. More than 400 episodes across more than 20 broadcast seasons. The show was canceled after its third season in 2002. It was revived for a fourth season in 2005. It was canceled again during that revival run, at least in the sense of being subject to scheduling chaos and poor treatment by the network, and survived anyway. It has generated lawsuits, FCC complaints filed by both advocacy organizations and private citizens, congressional attention, international broadcasting bans in multiple countries, advertiser boycott campaigns, social media firestorms that made national news, and decades of critical argument about whether it represented a genuinely subversive and intelligent form of television comedy, or simply the longest-running experiment in seeing how far a network animated show could push its luck, before someone made it stop. The answer, as it turned out, was a very long way indeed. But that distance was not traveled without cost, and the cost showed up in the content that was left behind, cut, buried, pulled, altered, or simply made and never shown. What you are about to settle into is a long and detailed journey through all of that content, through the full archive of what the show was not allowed to be, told in the order in which it happened, with the context each piece of hidden history deserves. We are going to move slowly, we are going to be thorough. And by the time we arrive at the end of this, you will have a genuinely complete picture of Family Guy's most invisible history, the history of what it made and could not show you. And what that history reveals about the show, the people who made it, the institution responsible for broadcasting it, and the complicated machinery of American broadcast television in the quarter century since the show first arrived. This is designed as a long listen, something to put on as the night deepens and the world outside gets quieter, something that builds as it goes, that rewards sustained attention, that fills the space between where you are now and where you are going next. Get comfortable. Let the room settle around you, and let us go back to where this story begins. Before we go any further, a quick pause. Drop a comment right now and tell the community where in the world you are and what time it is where you are. Whether you are deep in the middle of the night somewhere in Australia, or tucked in on a rainy afternoon in the UK, or starting a long evening in North America, or somewhere else entirely, let us know. I genuinely look forward to reading those comments. They create a kind of living geography of who finds these long, slow, detailed explorations of television history and how they find them and when. And if you are not subscribed, please do that now. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it is the most direct way to tell me that you want more of this. Now, everything Family Guy was not supposed to show you. Let us begin. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, who had studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design and spent his early professional years working at Hanna-Barbera on shows including Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. Before the show existed in anything like its final form, MacFarlane had made 2 short animated films, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, that introduced a heavyset, dim-witted man and his more articulate talking dog companion. Anyone who watches those shorts today can see immediately that they were the direct ancestors of Peter and Brian Griffin. The characterizations, the dynamic, the basic comedic logic of the pairing, all of it is already present in rough form. MacFarlane took those characters, revised them, built a family around them, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox liked what they saw. They gave him the green light. The show premiered immediately after Super Bowl 33 on the 31st of January 1999, with approximately 22 million viewers watching the first episode, a massive audience for a new animated show, boosted by the post-Super Bowl time slot that guaranteed an enormous captive audience for whatever aired after the game. From its very first episode, Family Guy was built on a kind of humor that required willingness to go places that other shows, and particularly other animated shows of that era, would not go. The cutaway gags that became the show's most recognized structural feature were from the beginning a mechanism for jokes that operated outside the normal rules of dramatic logic, rapid references to history, celebrity, politics, religion, race, gender, sexuality, and the full landscape of American popular culture, all deployed through the specific sensibility of MacFarlane and the writing team he assembled around him. The show was always intended to offend some of its audience some of the time. That was part of the design. The question that ran through all of it was always which people, under what circumstances, and whether the offense being produced was the point of the joke or simply the price of making the point. The answer to that question changed over time. It changed as MacFarlane's direct involvement in the creative process became more distant, as his other projects consumed more of his attention and energy. It changed as the writing staff turned over multiple times through cancellations and revivals and the ordinary attrition of talent in a long-running show. It changed as the political and cultural climate of the United States shifted around the show in ways that sometimes made things possible that had not been possible before, and sometimes made things impossible that had previously seemed ordinary. But the relationship between what the show wanted to say and what it was allowed to say was contentious from almost the very beginning, generating the first buried episode within the show's first 2 years of broadcast, and never arriving at any stable or peaceful resolution in the decades that followed. What follows is the record of that contention, told in order, told completely, told with the detail that each chapter of this history deserves. Section 2. Seth MacFarlane's near-death and the shadow it cast over the show. To understand why Family Guy developed the very specific and complicated relationship it did with tragedy, with real-world violence, with content that walked directly to the edge of something genuinely painful and sometimes tumbled right over, you have to understand something about the man who created it. Something that does not come up often enough in discussions of the show's controversial history, perhaps because it is uncomfortable to fold personal history into critical analysis. but that sits in the background of many of the most significant choices the show made in the decade after 2001. Something that colors, even if it does not determine, the show's persistent willingness to keep circling back to a specific date and a specific event and a specific cluster of images and names that most American television, by 2005 or 2008 or 2011, had largely learned to leave alone. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11. The flight was scheduled to depart from Boston's Logan International Airport at 7:45 in the morning, bound for Los Angeles, California. MacFarlane had been in Massachusetts the evening before, giving a lecture at his alma mater. He had attended the Rhode Island School of Design, but his connection to Emerson College in Boston was the relevant one here, and he had stayed overnight after the lecture engagement rather than returning to California the same night. He went out with some of the faculty after the event. He had a few drinks. He stayed out later than he had intended. The evening was enjoyable enough that he did not especially monitor the time. When he woke up the following morning, two things had conspired against him. The first was the mild hangover that comes from a night of social drinking that extends past the appropriate hour, slowing the morning routine in the way that a hangover does nothing severe, nothing debilitating, but the kind of fuzz that means you do not leap out of bed at the first alarm with complete alertness and perfect time management. The second was an error his travel agent had made in preparing his itinerary. She had written the departure time of the 7:45 a.m. flight as 8:15. She had been wrong by 30 minutes. That 30-minute discrepancy, combined with the slightly slower morning, meant that MacFarlane arrived at the departure gate for Flight 11 approximately 10 minutes after the gate had been closed. The airline would not board him. The gate had shut. The plane had pushed back from the terminal. He did not get on the plane. He went instead to the airport lounge. He ordered something. He sat down in a chair and, in the way that people do in airports when they have unexpected time to kill and the previous night has not been fully metabolized, he fell asleep. About 45 minutes later, the ambient sounds of the lounge changed in a way that reached through his sleep and pulled him upward toward consciousness. People were moving differently. Voices had a different quality, urgent in a way that was different from the ordinary urgency of a busy airport. He opened his eyes and looked at the nearest television screen and saw the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City with black smoke pouring from a wound in its upper floors. And then, as he began to process what he was seeing and to listen to what was being said around him, he understood which flight was involved. Flight 11, the flight he had been booked on. The one that had departed from the gate. He arrived at 10 minutes too late to board. He has described this experience in various interviews over the years, and each time the quality of his description has been notable for what it is not. Not dramatic, not performatively emotional, not organized around the narrative logic of miraculous survival that stories like this sometimes get shaped into. He has talked about turning to the person sitting next to him in the lounge at some point and saying something like, "I know that was the flight I was supposed to be on. I missed it. I was late." His assistant, who had received a voicemail from MacFarlane saying he had missed his flight and was waiting for the next one, did not receive and listen to that message until approximately 20 minutes after the attacks had already begun. During those 20 minutes, there were people in MacFarlane's life who knew his travel plans and did not yet know whether he had been on Flight 11. He was not. He was alive, sitting in the airport lounge, watching the second plane hit the South Tower on the television screens that nobody in that lounge could look away from. He sent his travel agent a basket of wine afterward, in gratitude for the scheduling error that had kept him alive. He has said on multiple occasions that he is not a fatalist, that he does not believe there was some larger plan at work, that close calls of that magnitude, near misses with catastrophic events, probably happen to people all the time in forms that are not as visible as this one, on highways and in operating rooms, and on flights that land without incident, and in 1,000 other unremarkable contexts where the difference between life and death is a few minutes and a minor coincidence. He received the gift of those few minutes and the minor coincidence, and he has spoken about it with the measured philosophical calm of someone who has thought carefully about what it means and decided that it means exactly as much as it does and not more. What it means for the story we are telling is harder to specify than a simple cause and effect relationship, Because human psychology does not produce neat cause and effect relationships around experiences of this magnitude, and neither does the creative culture of a television writer's room. MacFarlane did not go back to Family Guy in the fall of 2001 and make a conscious decision to process his near-death experience through the show's content. The production was ongoing. Episodes were scheduled. The third season was being produced. The machinery of television kept turning because that is what the machinery of television does. But Family Guy's relationship with September 11th over the course of its run is distinctive and worth examining at length. The show engaged with September 11th, with the attacks, with specific imagery and figures associated with that day, more directly and more persistently, and in more varied ways than almost any other mainstream animated comedy of its era. It made jokes about the attacks in the first season after they happened, carefully shaped by the standards of what was possible at that moment. It made satirical episodes in later years built around counterfactual scenarios. What would the world look like if the attacks had been prevented? What would have been different and how? The show depicted Osama bin Laden as a character in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. It used specific images and references associated with September 11th as the backdrop for humor and satire that ranged from genuinely intelligent to genuinely misguided and everything in between. But that was consistent in its refusal to treat the subject as something that comedy was not allowed to touch. Whether MacFarlane's proximity to that morning is part of what drove this is something he has not stated directly. But it is context that belongs in this story, because the show's relationship with September 11th generated some of the most significant pieces of hidden content in its history, content that was erased after the fact, content that was made in a world that no longer existed by the time anyone tried to air it, content that collided with a real-world tragedy in ways that made it impossible to show. The man who created the show had been, himself, approximately 10 minutes away from being one of September 11th's victims. The show he made kept going back to September 11th in ways that other shows did not. These two facts belong in the same frame, even if the line connecting them is not straight and cannot be fully mapped. The practical effects of September 11th on Family Guy's content were significant and immediate. The show was in the middle of its third season production when the attacks occurred. Certain material that had already been completed or was in production had to be reconsidered in light of what had happened. Some of it was altered. Some of it was removed entirely. The most famous of these removals, the Osama bin Laden scene from Road to Rhode Island, is the one that gets discussed most often, but it was not the only piece of content that the September 11th attacks changed or eliminated. The Twin Towers themselves appeared in the background of early episodes. The references and visual elements that had been ordinary before September 11th became loaded with new meaning after it, and the show had to navigate what to do with all of them under conditions of institutional pressure and public scrutiny and genuine collective grief that made every decision feel more consequential than it would have felt 3 weeks earlier. These decisions were not made with the luxury of careful deliberation. They were made quickly, under pressure, by people who were themselves processing the same shock that the rest of the country was processing. Some of what they did in those weeks and months in response to September 11th was principled editorial judgment. Some of it was institutional protectiveness. Some of it was simply the reaction of people who needed to do something and who did the most defensible available thing rather than the best possible thing, because the best possible thing was not identifiable in the immediate aftermath of an event of that magnitude. The trail of that response, what was cut, what was modified, what was kept, what was eventually restored years later when enough time had passed, is where the story of Family Guy's hidden content really begins. Section 3. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the first buried episode, the story of Family Guy's first genuine institutional confrontation over a complete, fully finished episode does not begin with a viewer complaint, or an FCC investigation, or a media controversy generated by something that aired and generated backlash. It begins in a Fox network conference room where executives reviewed a completed episode and made the decision not to broadcast it, not because it had harmed anyone, not because any complaint had been filed, not because any regulatory body had flagged it, but because the people in that room looked at the episode and decided that the potential downside of airing it exceeded the value of putting it on television. That calculation, made before a single member of the public had seen a frame of the episode, set a template that would repeat itself in various forms throughout the show's subsequent history. The episode is When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. Its production code is 2ACX05, which places it in the second season production run. It was written, developed, and animated during 1999 and 2000. Originally intended to air as part of the show's second broadcast season on Fox, the writer was Ricky Blitt and the director was Dan Povenmire, both of whom were significant contributors to the show's early creative identity. To understand what happened to this episode, you need to spend some time with what the episode actually is, because it has been discussed in terms that sometimes obscure what it was doing. The premise begins with Peter Griffin losing money through his characteristic combination of incompetence and poor decision-making. He is in financial trouble, as he frequently is, and he does not know how to fix it. While sitting with Cleveland and Quagmire at the bar, he overhears each of them mention, in passing, that Jewish professionals have helped them manage financial matters in their lives. Cleveland talks about a tax advisor. Quagmire mentions something similar. Peter takes this incidental information and builds a theory from it that would not survive 5 seconds of scrutiny from anyone with even minimal critical thinking capacity. Jewish people must have a special and innate talent for financial management. This is, of course, a stereotype, a prejudice, a wrong belief that Peter adopts with complete confidence, because Peter is the kind of person who adopts wrong beliefs with complete confidence. The episode knows this. The writing knows this. The audience is positioned, from the very setup of the episode, to understand that Peter is holding a prejudice, and to understand that his holding this prejudice is a symptom of his general intellectual inadequacy rather than an observation worth taking seriously. Peter sets out to find a Jewish financial advisor. After searching in typically clumsy Peter fashion, he connects with a man named Max Weinstein, played by Peter Riegert. Max is indeed a skilled and competent accountant, and he does help Peter sort out the financial mess he has made of his situation. Peter, delighted with this outcome and fully committed to the theory he has constructed, decides on the natural next step. He will have his son Chris convert to Judaism. That way, Chris will benefit from the same supposed talent throughout his life. He will have the inherited advantage of being Jewish. Lois learns about this plan and objects to it in the clearest possible terms. Her objection is the episode's argument stated plainly. Success has nothing to do with religion, and Peter's belief that it does reflects a prejudice about an entire community of people based on stereotypical assumptions rather than any actual knowledge. The episode builds through a sequence in which Peter takes Chris to a synagogue for a bar mitzvah ceremony over Lois's objections. Lois arrives to disrupt the ceremony. A comic chase sequence follows, and the episode concludes with Peter acknowledging that he was wrong and that Lois's view is the correct one. This is the classic structure of comedy that satirizes a prejudice. The prejudice is held by the character who is always wrong, corrected by the character who is always right, and the audience is positioned throughout to understand the wrongness of what is being depicted rather than to endorse it. The specific piece of content that raised alarm at Fox was a musical number performed by Peter called I Need a Jew. The number parodies the Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star, the signature melody from the 1940 animated film Pinocchio, a tune so deeply embedded in American cultural consciousness that its opening notes immediately summon associations with innocent childhood wishes, magical thinking, and the specific emotional register of classic Disney animation. Peter performs the number as a sincere expression of his desire to find a Jewish financial advisor, and the comedy comes from the profound mismatch between the yearning, magical quality of the melody and the banal, prejudiced content of what Peter is actually expressing. The original version of the lyrics includes a line that reads, when Peter sings it, "Even though they killed my Lord, I need a Jew." This is a reference to the old theological claim, formally repudiated by the Second Vatican Council in 1965, but still circulating in various cultural forms, that the Jewish people as a collective bore responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ. The line is exactly the kind of thing that Peter Griffin, a man who misunderstands almost everything he has ever learned about Catholicism, might genuinely believe. The line is not an endorsement of the deicide charge. It is a depiction of Peter Griffin believing something that is wrong, which is what Peter Griffin does throughout the entire run of the show. Fox's review of the completed episode flagged this content and determined that the episode could not air. The network's concern, as articulated at various points in the subsequent discussion, There was not that the episode was anti-Semitic in any straightforward sense. The network could see the satirical structure as clearly as anyone. The concern was about extractability, about what happened when individual moments from the episode were taken out of context, about the possibility that a news broadcast or an advocacy organization could play the "I Need a Jew" song or specific lines from it without the surrounding episode that gave those lines their satirical meaning, and present them as evidence that Family Guy was producing anti-Semitic content. In the media environment of 2000, before internet video sharing had fully transformed how media spread and was consumed, the clip fear was not unreasonable. A potentially damaging excerpt playing on a news program could cause significant reputational and business harm to the network. Seth MacFarlane pushed back. He had, before production even began on this episode, shown the script to two rabbis specifically to get their assessment of whether the material was anti-Semitic or whether it functioned as satire of anti-Semitism. Both rabbis approved the episode. Their reasoning, which MacFarlane shared with Fox, was that the episode's moral delivered clearly and without ambiguity by Lois at the conclusion is that Peter was wrong, that his prejudice was a prejudice, and that religion does not determine ability or success. The writer, Ricky Blitt, was Jewish himself. Ben Stein, who played the rabbi in the episode, was Jewish and had agreed to participate in the project with full knowledge of its content. MacFarlane also pointed out that approximately 70% of the show's writing staff at that time was Jewish, including the people who had helped develop and refine the episode through the production process. None of this changed Fox's decision. The episode was completed and shelved. It sat in a vault while the show it belonged to continued broadcasting without it. It sat through 2001, through the September 11th attacks, through the final stretch of the show's original third season. When the show was canceled in 2002, the episode still had not aired. It sat through the cancellation. What eventually gave the episode its avenue to air was the same thing that eventually gave the show itself a second life: Adult Swim. When Cartoon Network acquired the rights to Family Guy reruns and began airing them on the Adult Swim late-night programming block beginning in April of 2003, the production catalog that came with those rights included When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. Adult Swim operated as a cable network, subject to different regulatory standards than Fox's broadcast operation, and with a late-night audience that specifically sought out content that pushed further than broadcast television would allow. Adult Swim's programming team reviewed the episode and reached a different conclusion from Fox's. They would air it. The episode premiered on Adult Swim on the 9th of November 2003. More than 3 years had passed since it was produced. The show it belonged to had been canceled. The episode finally reached an audience. The response was not the catastrophe that Fox had feared. Critics who reviewed it found it reasonably effective as satire. Most viewers read it correctly as a commentary on anti-Semitic stereotyping rather than as an expression of anti-Semitism. The organized backlash that the network had anticipated, the coordinated campaign, the media coverage, the advertiser pressure did not materialize in any significant form. There was discussion of whether the episode had crossed lines, because there is always discussion of whether Family Guy episodes have crossed lines, but nothing approaching the crisis the network had been protecting itself from. Fox then aired the episode on their own network on the 10th of December 2004, using a modified version of the musical number. The line "Even Though They Killed My Lord" had been replaced, in the broadcast version, with an alternate recording. "I don't think they killed my lord." This change, small in terms of the words involved, significant in terms of the theological implication, was apparently sufficient for Fox's standards department. The substitution was imperfect in execution. The replacement audio was recorded over footage animated for the original line, which meant the lip movements in the broadcast version did not precisely match the audio being heard. The closed caption track showed the original line. If you watched both versions with attention to these details, the seam was visible. But the broadcast version existed, and the episode had finally aired on Fox 4 years after it was originally produced. Then came a lawsuit. In October of 2007, the Bourne Company, the publishing house that owned the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, filed suit against Fox, Cartoon Network, Fuzzy Door Productions, Seth MacFarlane, and the episode's musical composer Walter Murphy. The suit claimed that the "I Need a Jew" song had harmed the original song's commercial value and reputation by associating it with offensive content and that this association constituted copyright infringement beyond what fair use protections for parody typically allow. The Bourne Company argued that by connecting its song to anti-Semitic sounding lyrics and the broader context of a Family Guy episode, the defendants had irreparably damaged the song's value. The case moved through federal court for nearly 2 years. In March of 2009, United States District Judge Deborah Batts issued a ruling in favor of the defendants. The ruling found that I Need a Jew constituted legitimate parody protected by the fair use doctrine of the United States Copyright Act. Judge Batts included a notable passage in the ruling observing that the original song's association with wholesome, magical, aspirational contexts like its prominent role in Pinocchio actually made it more rather than less appropriate as a target for satirical subversion. The comedy of Peter's musical number depended on the audience knowing what the original song represented, which meant the parody was doing exactly what parody exists to do, taking something with one cultural resonance and recontextualizing it to comment on something else. The lawsuit was dismissed. Family Guy had gone to federal court over a buried episode and won. By the time the litigation concluded, the episode had been available in various forms for 6 years. It was part of the DVD release of the show's 3rd season. It aired in international markets. It had been absorbed into the show's history as one of the early episodes that Fox had initially refused to broadcast before eventually reconsidering. The version that most viewers encounter today through streaming platforms where they are available, or through DVD releases, is typically the network edit, with the modified lyric and a handful of other small alterations that different broadcast standards required at different moments. The fully uncensored version as originally produced exists in certain physical media releases. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was, in the end, the opening statement of a pattern. An episode that was good enough by every standard that mattered, the creator defended it, the community being depicted approved of it. It was eventually received without significant incident, was kept from the American broadcast audience for 3 years based on an institutional fear that proved, when tested against reality, to have been significantly worse than the actual situation warranted. The show made something worth showing. The institution responsible for showing it decided the risk was too high. The audience was protected from satire, and the template that this established institutional anxiety operating ahead of any actual harm, pulling content from public view based on anticipated rather than actual problems, would repeat itself in various forms throughout the show's entire subsequent history. Section 4. Road to Rhode Island and the Post. 9/11 Erasure. The scene that was removed from Road to Rhode Island stands as one of the most poignant examples in Family Guy's history of content that did not disappear because of anything it did wrong, but because the world it was made in changed so catastrophically and so quickly that the content was left stranded in a context it had never been designed for. This is a different category from When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which was buried by institutional anxiety about anticipated harm. Road to Rhode Island's Bin Laden scene was buried by actual harm by a real-world catastrophe that arrived 16 months after the episode aired and transformed what every element of the scene meant and how it could be. Received. Road to Rhode Island is an episode of Family Guy's 2nd season that aired on the 30th of May 2000. It is consistently cited in retrospectives on the show as one of the best episodes the show ever produced, and that assessment holds up when you watch it today. The episode was written by Gary Janetti and directed by Dan Povenmire, and it is notable for several things simultaneously. It is the first entry in what would become the Road to series of episodes featuring Brian and Stewie on some kind of journey together. It has one of the show's most genuinely moving sequences, involving Brian discovering what happened to his biological mother, and it demonstrates the specific combination of wit and warmth and dark comedy that characterized Family Guy at the height of its early run. The episode's premise is straightforward. Stewie has been staying with Peter's parents in Palm Springs, while Peter and Lois deal with some things at home. Brian volunteers to pick Stewie up and bring him back. They miss their flight. They have to make their way from Palm Springs to Rhode Island by whatever means are available, encountering various situations along the way. The episode establishes the Brian and Stewie road trip format that would generate some of the show's most beloved subsequent episodes, and it does so with a confidence and an ease that the show's first season had been building toward. The Bin Laden scene occurs in the airport section of the episode, early in the journey. Stewie, attempting to navigate airport security with a bag full of weapons he has constructed in his bedroom, this being Season 2, Stewie, the evil genius version who built functional death rays and intended to take over the world, needs to get his luggage through the X-ray scanner without the security personnel examining it carefully. His solution is a performance. He bursts into a rendition of On the Good Ship Lollipop from the 1934 Shirley Temple film Bright Eyes, tap dancing and singing with enough adorable baby in a diaper energy to distract the X-ray operators from paying attention to the screen while his bag glides through unexamined. After his bags are safely through, Stewie turns to the camera and remarks, in the dry and somewhat menacing British accent that defined his early season characterization, that he hopes Osama bin Laden does not know show tunes. The camera then cuts to another security line at the same airport. Osama bin Laden is standing in that line with his own bag. He performs I Hope I Get It from the original cast recording of a chorus line with complete commitment and considerable charm. His bag passes through the X-ray machine without incident. He makes it through security. The joke works on several levels that it is worth taking a moment to appreciate because the sophistication of the joke is part of what makes its removal so instructive about the costs of post-September 11th content decisions. At the first level, the image is simply funny. The incongruity of an internationally wanted terrorist cheerfully performing a Broadway number to game airport security is an unexpected visual that lands immediately. At a second level, the joke is making a point about airport security. Both Stewie, a 1-year-old carrying an arsenal, and bin Laden, a man wanted for mass murder, can slip through American airport security using nothing more than a charming performance. This was a real and frequently discussed criticism of American airport security procedures in 2,000 years before September 11th, made it clear how serious the vulnerability was. At a third level, the joke is the kind of topical current events reference that Family Guy had always been willing to make where other shows would not. Bin Laden was a known figure in 2000, wanted for the 1,998 embassy bombings, and his appearance here as a comedic character reflects the show's willingness to engage with the full landscape of current events as a source of comedic material. The episode aired. The joke landed in the way it was designed to land. The episode became, in the assessment of most fans and critics who have written about it, one of the best things the show had ever done. And then, 16 months later, everything about that scene changed. After the 11th of September 2001, there was no version of that scene that could be shown on American television. The joke's premise that American airport security was easy to circumvent had been confirmed in the most horrific possible way. The comic villain at the center of it had organized the attacks that had just killed nearly 3,000 people and changed the country in ways that were still being understood. The man who was supposed to be the punchline of a comedy bit was now the most wanted person in the world in the context of the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. The airport security critique that had seemed like a harmless satirical observation 16 months earlier now looked like a warning that nobody had heeded. None of this was the fault of the episode. None of it was caused by the episode, but all of it made the episode impossible to show. And that impossibility required a decision about what to do with it. The decision was to remove the scene. Every subsequent Fox airing of Road to Rhode Island used a version without the bin Laden sequence. The Region 1 DVD release of the episode, the standard American home video version, also omitted the scene. This meant that fans who bought the show on DVD were buying an already edited version, a version with an invisible gap where the scene had been. With no indication on the packaging or in any supplementary materials that anything was missing, the episode felt complete. The story of Brian and Stewie's journey still worked. The emotional payoff involving Brian's mother still landed. There was simply a hole in the airport section of the episode that you would only know to look for if you had seen the original broadcast. The scene survived in some international DVD pressings that had already been manufactured before the removal was implemented across all markets. It appeared in the Family Guy, The Freakin' Sweet Collection, a special compilation released in 2004, specifically aimed at hardcore fans who wanted the most complete experience of the show's best material. And it was eventually restored to the Hulu streaming version of the episode sometime around 2017, more than 15 years after the original broadcast, 6 years after bin Laden was killed in the US. Special forces raid on his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. By the time the restoration happened, enough time and enough specific real-world events had intervened that the scene had become possible to air again without feeling like an open wound. Seth MacFarlane's commentary for the episode, recorded for DVD releases, includes a remark that has become something of a dark footnote in discussions of this moment in the show's history. He observed that the moral of the Bin Laden sequence was that the FBI should watch Family Guy more often. In the context of May 2000, this was playful self-congratulation, a joke about the show's awareness of current events and its willingness to point out things that more cautious shows would not. In the context of late 2001, the same remark had acquired a quality of tragic resonance that nobody would have chosen. The Twin Towers removals happened in a quieter register. The World Trade Center towers appear as background elements in two early Family Guy episodes, A Picture's Worth $1,000 from Season 1, and Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from Season 2 in shots that depict the New York City skyline. The towers in both cases are simply there, in the background, as part of an accurate depiction of the Manhattan skyline before September 2001. After the attacks, both appearances were digitally edited out of subsequent airings and DVD releases. The shots remain, but the skyline in them was altered to remove the buildings. This kind of retroactive erasure of the World Trade Center from existing visual media was common across American television in the months following the attacks. It happened in The Sopranos, in Sex and the City, in various other shows and films that had been made when the towers were simply part of the background. But documenting it in Family Guy is worth doing for the same reason that all of this documentation is worth doing. It is a change made to the show's archive that most viewers have no way of knowing occurred. What is genuinely strange about the post-September 11th content decisions in Family Guy, and what fans have noted in online discussions for years, is the inconsistency in how the attacks were treated as a subject in the years that followed. The same institutional apparatus that carefully removed the Twin Towers from background shots in early episodes and cut the Bin Laden scene from Road to Rhode Island also allowed, in subsequent seasons, episodes and jokes that engaged with September 11th in ways far more direct and far more explicitly comedic than a background skyline or a musical number. Later seasons of the show reference the attacks as comedy material. One of the show's most discussed later storylines involves time travel and the question of what would have happened if September 11th had been prevented. There are multiple subsequent Bin Laden appearances in later seasons, made after the cultural temperature had changed enough to make those appearances feel different from how they would have felt in October of 2001. The line between what was appropriate to show and what was not kept moving. It was not calibrated by any stable principle. It was calibrated by the current moment's emotional state and the institutional anxiety level of the people responsible for the content decisions, and both of those things changed as time passed and as the events of that morning receded into history. The Bin Laden scene in Road to Rhode Island was removed because the cultural moment made it impossible to keep, and eventually, when the cultural moment had changed enough, the scene came back. Not because anyone had made a principled decision about it, because enough time had passed that the question of what to do with it had answered itself. This is one of the ways that hidden content in television is different from other kinds of institutional decisions. It is not always permanent. Things that are removed from the archive can be restored to it. The archive itself is a living thing, shaped by the decisions made around it at every stage. Not a fixed record, but an ongoing negotiation between what was made and what the current moment is willing to let exist. The Road to Rhode Island situation is one of the cleaner examples of this. The scene was removed, the scene was restored, the restoration happened without ceremony because, by 2017, the question it once raised had become historical rather than live. But not every piece of hidden content gets restored, and some of the most significant pieces of what Family Guy made and could not show are still buried. And whether they ever get restored depends on whether the people responsible for those decisions ever decide that the moment has changed enough to reconsider them. Section 5, PTV, and the FCC War, Censoring the Censorship episode. There is a very specific kind of irony that becomes available when a television episode produced to criticize the institution of broadcast censorship gets censored before it can air in the form its creators intended. It is the kind of irony that is almost too neat, almost too self-referential, almost too perfect as an illustration of the problem it is trying to describe. And yet that is precisely the story of the Family Guy episode PTV, which aired in November of 2005 during the show's fourth season, and which arrived at the television audience as a document that had been shaped by the exact institutional forces it was arguing against. To understand PTV as a piece of television history rather than just a piece of television, you need to understand what was happening in American broadcasting culture in 2004 and 2005. On the 1st of February 2004, during the halftime show of Super Bowl 38, Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake performed together at Reliant Stadium in Houston. Near the end of their performance, Timberlake pulled away a portion of Jackson's costume, briefly exposing her breast on live national television. The exposure lasted less than a second. The FCC received over 500,000 complaints in the weeks that followed, though it later emerged that a significant proportion of those complaints had been generated by a coordinated campaign organized by the Parents Television Council, rather than spontaneous individual responses. Nevertheless, the event's political visibility was enormous, and the institutional response was substantial. The FCC levied a fine of $550,000 against CBS, the network that had broadcast the Super Bowl. Congress moved to dramatically increase the maximum penalty for broadcast indecency violations, raising it from the pre-2004 level of approximately $27,500 per incident to $325,000. This was more than a tenfold increase in the potential penalty for a finding of indecency. Network executives across the major broadcast channels became substantially more conservative about content in the aftermath of this change. Standards and practices departments that had been operating with certain latitude tightened up. The regulated hours of broadcast television became noticeably more anxious, more subject to preemptive self-censorship by the networks themselves, more likely to generate conservative editorial decisions driven by fear of the new, much larger fines. Seth MacFarlane, watching this from his position as creator and showrunner of one of the most consistently provocative shows in primetime broadcast, was furious. He said so directly in a public interview about PTV, using language that did not leave room for ambiguity about his feelings. The episode he made in response is a work of creative rage-pointed, satirical, specific in its argument, and unmistakable in its position. PTV dramatizes a fictional version of the post-Super Bowl censorship wave. A wardrobe malfunction at the Emmy Awards involving a character based on the actor David Hyde Pierce, depicted in a version of the incident that is considerably more explicit than the original trigger's FCC action. The FCC begins by censoring broadcast television content, then escalates to censoring the actual behavior of citizens in the fictional town where the Griffin family lives. Agents walk through the streets bleeping profanity, placing black bars over anything deemed indecent, fining people for things they do in their own homes. The satire is about the logical endpoint of regulatory overreach. If you accept the premise that the FCC has legitimate authority to sanitize broadcast content based on a single incident, where does that authority end? The episode's answer is that it ends in the complete regulation of human experience, which is of course absurd, and the absurdity is the point. Peter, in a response that frames him for this episode as a defender of creative freedom rather than the selfish fool he more often is, creates his own cable broadcast network he calls PTV. It carries original programming with titles like The Peter Griffin Sideboob Hour and Midnight Q and Dogs Humping, as well as classic television shows rebroadcast in their original, unedited forms. PTV is successful audiences who are hungry for uncensored content, find it and watch it enthusiastically. The FCC eventually shuts PTV down. But by the episode's conclusion, Peter and the family have traveled to Washington, D.C., and successfully lobbied Congress to reverse the FCC's regulations. The episode ends with broadcast television restored to its pre-censorship state. The argument of this episode is clear and direct. The FCC's post-Super Bowl response was an act of institutional overreach that prioritized the squeamishness of a vocal minority over the legitimate entertainment needs and preferences of an adult majority. MacFarlane was not simply making a show about censorship for artistic reasons, he was making an argument, specifically about the regulatory environment that was currently constraining his own show, and he was making it in the only form available to him, which was the show itself. Fox's standards department reviewed PTV as it was being produced and required the removal of multiple scenes before the episode could be broadcast. The most discussed of these cuts involves a segment called Douchebags, a parody of the Jackass franchise in which Peter and Cleveland perform a physical stunt that involves defecating on top of Lois's car. The segment was removed from the broadcast version. It was restored in the DVD release of Season 4, which came out after the broadcast season and was marketed, as DVD releases for the show generally were, as the fuller and more complete version of the episodes. The production process for PTV involved what a Chicago Tribune article described as horse trading between the show's writers and Fox's standards reviewers. For every piece of content the writers wanted to include, the standards reviewers would identify problems. The two sides would negotiate. Remove this body part reference and we will allow this language to stay. Cut this specific sequence and we will greenlight that one. The broadcast version of PTV that eventually aired was the product of this negotiation, a version that both the writers and the network could live with, that was not what the writers had originally intended, and that had been shaped by precisely the kind of institutional pressure the episode was satirizing. There is something worth sitting with in the specific structure of this situation. The writers made a show arguing that creative content should not be shaped by the institutional fears of broadcast television. In order to air that show on broadcast television, they had to allow its content to be shaped by the institutional fears of broadcast television. The episode arguing against the censorship machine was itself run through the censorship machine. The finished product that reached the audience was already a compromise, already a document that bore the marks of the negotiation the episode was arguing should not have to happen. The DVD version of PTV, which restored the douchebag segment and several other smaller modifications, became the version that fans who cared about the distinction between intended content and broadcast content sought out. This was a consistent pattern across the show's run from Season 4 onward. The DVD version was the creator's cut. The version that showed what had actually been made before the standards review shaped it into something the network was comfortable broadcasting. For hardcore fans who bought the physical media, the DVD versions were the canonical versions. For casual viewers who watched the show on television or, later, on streaming platforms where the broadcast cut is generally the version available, the compromises were invisible. PTV was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program following its broadcast. The director, Dan Povenmire, received an Annie Award nomination for his work on the episode. These recognitions represent the television industry's formal acknowledgement that the episode was worth noticing, which is either a vindication of its quality or a reminder that the television industry's relationship with its own censorship apparatus is deeply strange, or possibly both simultaneously. What PTV represents in the broader story of Family Guy's hidden content is the most visible moment of the tension that was always present in the show's production relationship with Fox. The show wanted to make things the network would not allow in their broadcast form. The network's standards department shaped the show's content through a negotiation process that was ongoing and sometimes contentious, and that produced broadcast versions that were already edited versions of what had been made. The DVD releases preserved the fuller versions. The archive was bifurcated between the broadcast record and the home video record, and the gap between them was widest for the episodes that had pushed hardest against the institutional constraints of broadcast television. The PTV situation also established something that would become an important feature of the show's public identity in the years that followed: the explicit, self-referential acknowledgement by the show itself that it operated within constraints that it found limiting. The show made jokes about Fox, about the FCC, about its own censorship, about the fact that things it wanted to say were being prevented from being said. This meta-commentary became one of the show's recurring modes in its middle and later seasons, the show performing awareness of its own institutional situation as a substitute for, or sometimes alongside, the act of actually changing that situation. Whether this self-awareness reads as wit, or as a form of resignation to constraints that the show had decided it could not overcome, depends on your disposition toward the show and toward the broader question of what creative freedom in corporate entertainment actually looks like. Section 6. Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon. The story of Turban Cowboy, Family Guy's 11th season episode that aired in March of 2013 and was subsequently removed from American streaming platforms for nearly a decade, is one of the most genuinely disturbing examples in the show's history of content disappearing, not because of anything the show did wrong, but because of events entirely outside its control that changed what the show's content meant and how it could be received. Turban Cowboy aired on Fox on the 17th of March 2013. It is not a good episode. Critics identified multiple problems with it. Its central plot attempts an anti-Islamophobia message that it then completely undermines by having the episode's Muslim character turn out to actually be a terrorist, validating precisely the prejudiced suspicion that the episode seemed to be arguing against. The AV Club gave it a D, one of the more decisive critical assessments a Family Guy episode received in that period. The episode would have been remembered, if it was remembered at all, as a bad installment in a declining season, a forgettable entry in the show's catalog that illustrated the difficulty the show was having by season 11 of telling coherent stories with consistent internal logic. The episode also contains a cutaway gag involving the Boston Marathon. In the gag, Bob Costas interviews Peter about his performance in the race. A flashback shows Peter's winning strategy. He drove his car through the course, hitting and killing other runners as he went. The joke is about Peter's complete absence of sportsmanship and his characteristic willingness to do something monstrous if it gets him what he wants. The gag has nothing to do with terrorism. It has nothing to do with the episode's main plot. It is a disconnected piece of dark slapstick in the tradition of cutaway gags the show had been doing for years. On the 15th of April, 2013, 29 days after the episode aired, 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs were detonated near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed, over 260 were injured, and 17 survivors would require amputation of limbs. The attack was the deadliest act of terrorism on American soil since the 11th of September 2001. The perpetrators were 2 brothers, Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev. The investigation, the manhunt, and the trial that followed occupied the American news media for months and years. Within hours of the attack, a video appeared on YouTube. Someone had taken the Turban Cowboy episode and deliberately edited 2 scenes together: the marathon cutaway, showing Peter's car running down runners, and a separate scene from the episode's actual plot involving the character Mahmoud and explosives being detonated by cell phone. These 2 scenes had nothing to do with each other in the original episode. They were from completely different parts of the narrative, but edited together in a specific sequence, they appeared to show Family Guy depicting a bombing at the Boston Marathon using a cell phone detonator. The edited video was fabricated. It was not a discovery. It was a manufactured connection between a piece of existing entertainment and a real-world atrocity, created by someone acting in bad faith for purposes that included spreading a conspiracy theory about the attacks being staged. Alex Jones promoted the edited video on his InfoWars platform and on his Twitter account, characterizing it as evidence of a false flag operation. The promotion by a figure with a large following who was already associated with conspiracy theories about mass tragedies gave the manufactured video a reach it would not otherwise have achieved, spreading it into online communities where the audience was specifically predisposed to believe in exactly the kind of manufactured connection the video implied. McFarlane responded publicly, calling the edited video abhorrent and making clear in terms that left no room for ambiguity that the episode had nothing to do with the Boston Marathon bombing, that it had aired a month before the attacks, and that the juxtaposition of the clips was the product of deliberate, deceptive editing rather than any genuine connection. YouTube removed the video, but the damage, in the specific form that social media damage takes, had already been distributed. Fox pulled the episode from Fox.com and Hulu on the 17th of April, 2013, 2 days after the attack. A network spokesperson confirmed the removal and stated that there were no immediate plans to rebroadcast the episode. The grounds for the removal were not about any actual connection between the episode and the attacks. No one was arguing such a connection existed. The removal was a gesture of institutional deference to a city in acute grief, a signal that the network was not going to have a scene of marathon runners being mowed down by a car available on its streaming platforms, while first responders were still counting the injured. Turban Cowboy was absent from American streaming platforms for 9 years. It returned to Hulu in September of 2022 without announcement. Its restoration was simply part of the catalog updating that streaming platforms perform as a routine matter. By 2022, both Tsarnaev brothers were dead or in prison, the legal proceedings were complete, and the raw grief of April 2013 had become historical memory. The episode's 9-year absence ended not through any formal decision that the moment had come to restore it, but through the ordinary passage of time, making the question answer itself. What Turban Cowboy adds to the archive of Family Guy's hidden content is the element of manufactured connection, the specific risk that in an era of rapidly spreading social media, a piece of existing content can be edited and recontextualized by a third party acting in bad faith and presented as something it is not, in ways that have consequences for the original content regardless of the falseness of the connection. The show did nothing wrong in making Turban Cowboy. The episode was not good, but it was not malicious, and it had nothing to do with the Boston Marathon bombing. It paid the price of a decade's absence from the American streaming archive because someone else decided to use it as a tool for spreading a conspiracy theory about an event that killed 3 people and injured hundreds more. That is a category of hidden content that has no precedent in the pre-social media era of television, and that will likely generate more examples as time goes on. The conditions that produce the Turban Cowboy situation, a highly connected social media environment, bad faith actors willing to manipulate media, a culture of conspiracy theory that has large and organized online communities have not gone away. What happened to this episode is a preview of a specific kind of risk that all long-running entertainment content now carries. The risk that a show made in good faith will be taken out of context by someone else and associated with something catastrophic in a way that the show cannot prevent and cannot fully correct. Section 7. Partial Terms of Endearment. The episode America was never allowed to see. There is, in the entire catalog of Family Guy's more than 400 broadcast episodes, exactly one that has never aired on American television in any form. Not on Fox. Not on Adult Swim, which aired When You Wish Upon a Weinstein after Fox refused to. Not in syndication. Not on any cable channel that has ever licensed the show's rerun rights. Not on Hulu, where the show has been available for years. Not on Disney Plus, where the rest of the show's catalog eventually arrived. The episode exists. It is finished. It is fully animated and voiced and scored and edited. Every person involved in its production was paid for their work. The lawyers reviewed it. The writers defended it. The creator of the show publicly argued that it should be shown. And in the United States, it has never been shown. The episode is Partial Terms of Endearment, the 21st episode of Family Guy's 8th season. It was written by Danny Smith, who was one of the show's longest-tenured writers, and it was directed by Joseph Lee. Before a single word of the script had been drafted, Seth MacFarlane asked Danny Smith to read an essay by Carl Sagan. Yes, that Carl Sagan, the astronomer and science communicator, titled Abortion. Is it possible to be both pro-life and pro-choice? The Sagan essay, published in the book Billions and Billions, was a careful and measured examination of the abortion debate that tried to articulate exactly what the moral weight of the question was and where the reasonable points of disagreement between different positions actually resided. It was not a polemic. It was an attempt to think rigorously about a question that political discourse had largely reduced to tribal signaling. MacFarlane gave Smith this essay as a starting point because that was the kind of episode he wanted to make, not a political position piece, not an argument for one side, but something that engaged seriously with the actual complexity of the question. The story that Smith developed from that starting point is, by Family Guy standards, a genuinely careful piece of writing. Lois runs into Naomi Robinson, an old college friend she had a close relationship with. The episode also establishes, in a quick and characteristically direct Family Guy fashion, that the two had experimented sexually during their college years, which produces Peter's initial misunderstanding that Naomi is asking for a threesome when she actually has a proposal for Lois. What Naomi wants is for Lois to serve as a surrogate mother. She and her husband Dale have been unable to conceive, and she has found in Lois someone she trusts deeply enough to carry a child for them. Peter is uncomfortable with this from the moment it's proposed. His discomfort is comedic and specific to Peter. He is not processing this from a position of principled conviction, but from a combination of male possessiveness, general incomprehension of anything outside his immediate experience, and the characteristic Peter Griffin approach to situations he doesn't understand, which is to object to them loudly and without much internal justification. Lois, after some consideration, decides to go through with the surrogacy. She believes it is the right thing to do for her friend. She believes she is capable of handling the emotional complexity of carrying a child that she will give to someone else. She is going into this with what seems like a reasonable and thought-through decision. Peter's attempts to intervene in or derail the pregnancy are played in the heightened, cartoon logic key that the show uses for its more absurd physical comedy sequences. The most extended of these is a sequence that explicitly parodies Looney Tunes' Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, specifically in which Peter lures Lois to the desert with DVDs of Grey's Anatomy and attempts to engineer a miscarriage through elaborate contraptions, all of which backfire on him in classic cartoon physics fashion. The sequence is funny, and it's also doing something that good Family Guy often does, using the most outrageously cartoonish possible approach to dramatize something real. Peter cannot accept what Lois has chosen to do and is trying to physically prevent it, which tells you something about how this version of Peter relates to his wife's bodily autonomy, and the fact that all of his schemes collapse into farce on him is the episode's comment on that approach. Then the situation changes in a way nobody anticipated. Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident. They are gone. Lois is now pregnant with a child that has no parents waiting to receive it, and she has to decide what to do. There are two options available to her: carry the pregnancy to term and put the baby up for adoption, or end the pregnancy. The episode gives both of these options their due. It does not treat this as a question with an obvious answer. It does not tip its hand early about where it is going. What it does is walk Lois and the audience through the experience of trying to make a genuinely difficult decision under genuinely difficult circumstances without the benefit of the person you made the decision for still being alive to weigh in. Peter, for his part, gets recruited by anti-abortion activists into the pro-life position. His journey through anti-abortion advocacy is what you would expect from Peter Griffin's approach to any political conviction. He embraces it with complete, uncritical enthusiasm, gets swept up in the performative aspects of it, and deploys the arguments for his new position in the specific Peter Griffin way, which is to say loudly, confidently, and with no real understanding of what the underlying principles actually are. When Brian poses the question, well, what about a woman who is raped? Peter's response is a perfect Peter non sequitur that is also a precise satirical statement about the quality of thinking behind a lot of performative pro-life advocacy. Maybe she should have thought of that before she asked me for directions. Lois ultimately decides to end the pregnancy. The episode doesn't editorialize about this decision in any heavy-handed way. It is presented as what it is: Lois Griffin making a difficult, considered, personal choice about a situation that has no clean answer. The final moment of the episode is blackly funny and formally bold. The family is at the dinner table, Lois begins to refer to the new member of the family, and Peter turns directly to the camera and says, "We had the abortion, cut to credits." That final line, direct, flat, unapologetic, delivered without softening, is a perfect piece of Family Guy writing. It refuses sentimentality. It refuses the instinct to smooth the roughness off the ending, to give the audience something comfortable to hold. It trusts the audience to sit with the discomfort of the choice and the directness of the language. It is, in that sense, exactly what MacFarlane said he wanted the episode to be: an honest engagement with a genuinely difficult topic, not a political position piece, but a human story that takes seriously the weight of what it is depicting. Fox reviewed the episode before the 8th season had even finished airing and informed the production that they would not be broadcasting it. The decision was announced publicly at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, before Season 8 had aired on Fox, meaning the episode's ban was part of the public record of the show before most viewers had seen the rest of the season it belonged to. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Reilly later explained the decision in terms that have been widely quoted because of how directly they articulate the institutional calculus that produced it. He said that abortion was the single most politically hot-button issue of all the issues that could come up, that the economy was struggling at the moment the decision was being made, and that advertisers were particularly cautious during a period of economic fragility. He said he thought the episode handled the subject well. He said this explicitly, in public, on record, but that it felt like it could cause trouble, and it was just not worth it. That last phrase is the operative one. Not, the episode is bad. Not, the episode is wrong. Not, the episode crosses an ethical line. Just, it could cause trouble, and it is not worth it. This is institutional entertainment decision-making, stripped of any pretense about being motivated by anything other than financial risk management. The person in charge of programming at Fox Broadcast Television said, on the record, that a piece of television he thought was good and well executed was being withheld from the audience because it might make advertisers uncomfortable during a bad economic period. The creative work was subordinated to the advertiser relationship. The audience was protected from content not because the content was harmful to anyone, but because certain major purchasers of advertising time might have strong feelings about the subject matter and might express those feelings by purchasing less advertising time. MacFarlane pushed back. He had been through this with When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and he believed based on that experience that Fox would eventually air the abortion episode the same way they had eventually aired the Jewish one. He said publicly that he expected the same resolution. He was wrong. Unlike the Weinstein episode, which eventually made it to Adult Swim and then to Fox itself, Partial Terms of Endearment was also refused by Adult Swim, which declined to air it after Fox made the request. Adult Swim's refusal is notable because the cable network had been willing to air When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which is to say that the organization that had previously been more adventurous than Fox in its content decisions looked at the abortion episode and reached the same conclusion. This suggests that the question of abortion in an animated comedy context is in a special category of political sensitivity even within the cable television environment that generally operates with considerably more latitude than broadcast. The episode's first airing was in the United Kingdom, on BBC Three, on the 20th of June 2010. It was broadcast there as part of the ordinary schedule for the 8th season's UK run, placed between two other 8th season episodes in the slot it would have occupied if it had aired in sequence. A slightly edited version adjusted for time and some content aired in the UK and reached just under 1 million homes. Critical response in the UK was mostly positive. The episode was subsequently made available on the Season 8 DVD and Blu-ray releases, which came out in the United States on the 28th of September, 2010. This is the version that American viewers who want to see it can access. The physical media release, sitting in the section of the season between episodes 20 and 22, available to anyone who either buys the DVD or finds it through other means. It is not available on Hulu. It is not on Disney+. It does not appear in the streaming version of the show's catalog in the United States. More than 15 years after it was produced, after a Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022 and returned the question of abortion legality to individual states, making the subject of abortion more urgently politically charged than it had been at almost any point since 1973, Partial Terms of Endearment remains the only episode of Family Guy that the United States broadcast and streaming market has never permitted its audience to see. The signal this sends is clear to anyone paying attention. Some subjects are too politically volatile to be touched by entertainment, regardless of how the entertainment handles them. It does not matter whether the episode is good. Kevin Riley said it was good. It does not matter whether it is fair to both sides. The critical consensus was that it engaged thoughtfully with the abortion debate without being a one-sided polemic. It does not matter whether the creator believed it should be shown. MacFarlane clearly did. None of these things were sufficient to overcome the institutional judgment that showing an animated comedy episode in which Lois Griffin has an abortion was too financially risky to attempt in the American broadcast market. This is perhaps the most honest document in the entire archive of Family Guy's hidden content. It is not hidden because of bad faith on the show's part. It is not hidden because of real-world catastrophe making it impossible to show. It is not hidden because of manufactured controversy or regulatory complaint. It is hidden because the financial infrastructure of American broadcast television found the subject matter too dangerous to monetize. And it has remained hidden, without any indication that this situation will change, for over a decade and a half. Section 8. The Brian Griffin Death Controversy, a stunt that broke the internet. On the 24th of November 2013, a Sunday evening, which was still the show's home on Fox's animation domination lineup, approximately 4.58 million people watched the 6th episode of Family Guy's 12th season air in real time. The episode was called Life of Brian. Within minutes of its conclusion, those viewers had collectively produced a level of online activity that major news organizations found newsworthy. The hashtags RIP Brian and Bring Back Brian both trended nationally on Twitter within an hour of the episode ending. A Change.org petition demanding the resurrection of the character accumulated more than 100,000 signatures in its first 72 hours, making it one of the fastest-growing entertainment-related petitions in the platform's history at that point. Facebook memorial pages appeared immediately and gathered hundreds of thousands of followers. The story was covered by CNN, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, The Wall Street Journal, and the CBC, among others. Seth MacFarlane's name trended on social media in a context of sustained and organized fan anger that he described in a January 2014 interview as something that surprised everyone on the production. What happened in Life of Brian is, at its core, simple. Brian Griffin, the talking dog who had been the voice of reason and intellectual anchor of the Griffin family since the show's first episode in 1999, was hit by a speeding car while crossing the street outside the family's house. He was rushed to a veterinary hospital. His injuries were too severe. He died on the operating table, with the Griffin family gathered around him. Stewie, who had become Brian's closest companion through the show's middle seasons, was there. The death was treated with something approaching genuine seriousness. The family's grief was played relatively straight, with a minimum of the comedic undercutting that the show routinely applied to its dramatic moments. Peter delivered a eulogy. Stewie was visibly devastated. The sequence was, as AV Club critic Eric Thurm wrote in his review, actually pretty poignant, coming as close as Family Guy can to genuinely moving. The same episode that showed Brian's death also introduced his replacement, a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, who had spent most of his career as Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. Vinny was a street-smart, affable, Italian-accented mutt who moved into the Griffin household with jarring speed, filling the physical and social space that Brian had occupied. The rapidity of this transition, Brian dead and grieved in one act, Vinny introduced and more or less accepted by the end of the same episode, struck many viewers as the most disrespectful element of the whole situation. The show seemed to be saying that any dog would do, that Brian's replacement was a simple transaction, that the years of investment viewers had in the character could be set aside and replaced with something new without any serious interval for what had been lost to register. This reading was harsh but not entirely unfair. The executive producer, Steve Callahan, told E! Online in November 2013 that the decision to kill Brian had been pitched in the writer's room and had caught fire, and that the team thought it could be a fun way to shake things up. He said they felt Brian getting hit by a car was more in the realm of reality, more believable as a tragic accident than if one of the kids had died. This framing made the death sound like a storytelling technique chosen for its plausibility rather than its narrative necessity, which is not a reassuring thing to say about the death of a character audiences had spent 14 years with. The show had also, crucially, done something in the episodes immediately preceding this one that made Brian's death feel like it was supposed to be permanent. Stewie had destroyed his time machine. This was positioned as a significant character beat, Stewie finally committing to living in the present, finally releasing the capacity for temporal manipulation that had been one of his defining abilities since the show's earliest days. The time machine's destruction was set up as a meaningful choice with consequences, and the immediate consequence was that when Brian was hit by a car and dying on the table, Stewie could not go back and undo it. The mechanism by which Family Guy had always eventually reset everything back to normal was gone. The death had the structural scaffolding of something permanent. This was the condition under which 4.58 million people watched the episode and then went to Twitter and signed petitions and created memorial Facebook pages and told the show exactly how they felt about what had been done. They had been given a death that looked like it was designed to last. The emotional devastation of that possibility, the idea that Brian Griffin was actually permanently gone from a show that had been running for 14 years, produced the kind of reaction that networks dream about in terms of engagement and fear, in terms of the fury of the form it takes. 21 days later, on the 15th of December, 2013, the episode Christmas Guy aired. The resolution of the Christmas Guy episode reveals that there was, in another timeline, another version of Stewie's time machine that had not been destroyed. Stewie, the present Stewie, the grieving Stewie, the one who had watched Brian die, travels back in time using this other machine and pushes Brian out of the path of the car that was going to kill him. Brian lives, The timeline in which Brian died is erased. Vinny, who had been introduced with what seemed like the intention of making him a fixture of the show, is retroactively removed from existence. The reset button is pressed with a hard click. Everything that had happened in the 3 weeks between the episodes, Brian's death, the grief, Vinny's arrival, the fan fury, the petitions, the trending hashtags, the hundreds of thousands of memorial Facebook followers, all of it becomes the record of a version of events that no longer exists within the show's internal reality. After Brian returned, MacFarlane posted on Twitter, "Thanks for caring so much about the canine griffin. He is overcome with gratitude." And then, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be fucking high. This is the line that settled the question of what the whole thing had been. It had been a stunt. A rating stunt in the specific language that critics and fans used, and that language is precise. The show killed its most beloved character not because the story required it, not because the creative team had a vision for what the show would become without him, not because MacFarlane had decided that Brian Griffin's arc was complete and the right creative choice was to let him go. They killed him because they wanted people to talk about the show, and then they brought him back when enough people had talked about it. The death that was designed to look permanent was designed to look permanent precisely so that the emotional shock of it would generate the engagement. And then the resurrection, 3 weeks later, was the conclusion of the stunt, the reveal that the whole thing was a magic trick and the trick was the real product. The reaction to the resurrection was bifurcated in a way that reveals something interesting about what audience engagement with long-running shows actually looks like. Some fans were genuinely delighted to have Brian back and treated MacFarlane's self-congratulatory tweet with the good-natured humor it was clearly intended to project. Others were furious not just about the original death but about the resurrection, because the resurrection made the death retroactively meaningless and, in doing so, made the grief that the death had produced retroactively ridiculous. People who had signed the petition and cried at the episode and tweeted their anger were now in the position of having been manipulated into an emotional response by a production that had no intention of honoring the premise of that response. The trick was clever, but the people it was played on did not all find it funny. MacFarlane said in January 2014 that the production team was surprised by the rage that they had anticipated a stir, but not the intensity of the reaction. This is one of those statements that is either completely sincere or almost certainly incomplete, because any group of professional television writers who decided to kill the most popular main character of a show that had been running for 14 years and then told the audience they could not reverse it, who had those writers, not conducted a basic estimate of what the response would be? The answer is probably that they estimated it correctly, and they were surprised by the intensity in the same way that a controlled experiment sometimes produces a larger result than the experimenters predicted. They knew what they were doing. They underestimated how well it would work. What the Brian death controversy added to the archive of Family Guy's hidden content is something qualitatively different from what the previous chapters have described. The other cases in this story involve content that was made and not shown, episodes buried by institutional anxiety, scenes removed by real-world catastrophe, episodes banned by the political sensitivities of the broadcast-advertiser relationship. The Brian death case is about content that was shown and then unmade about a version of events that existed in the show's canon for 3 weeks and was then retroactively erased. The Life of Brian episode exists in the archive. The Christmas Guy episode exists in the archive. But the canonical version of the show's reality, within the world of the story, treats the events of Life of Brian as having never happened. Brian was never actually dead, in the sense that matters to the ongoing story. The version of the show in which he stayed dead, the version that millions of people lived with for 3 weeks and grieved for and petitioned to undo that version, does not exist anymore. It is hidden in a different way from the other hidden content in this story. It is hidden by the act of its own undoing. The show erased it from its own reality while leaving the episodes themselves intact in the archive. The result is a version of the archive that contains something that contradicts itself. Brian is dead in episode 6, and then he is alive in episode 8, and the world of the show behaves as if episode 6 never happened while the episode itself sits there in the catalog, a record of something the show's own logic says did not occur. This is perhaps the purest illustration of what a show that will not commit to consequences actually produces in its archive. A kind of temporal scar, a record of its own unwillingness to follow through on what it started. The stunt generated enormous engagement, enormous press coverage, a temporary spike in viewership, and a permanent entry in the record of Family Guy's strangest decisions. What it did not generate was a version of the show in which the most interesting possible story, what would Family Guy look like without Brian Griffin, genuinely and permanently, was actually told. Section 9. The deep archive deleted scenes, lost moments, and the content nobody documented. Every television show, in the course of being made, produces far more material than the version that eventually airs. The process of writing, rewriting, recording, animating, editing, reviewing, revising, and finalizing an episode is a process of constant reduction, of choosing what stays and what goes, of deciding which jokes are essential and which are expendable, of finding the shape of the episode within the larger mass of material that was generated in pursuit of that shape. The finished episode is always a selection from a larger body of work. And in a show that ran for more than 25 seasons, the body of work from which those selections were made is enormous. Family Guy has a specific and well-documented relationship with its deleted scenes from season 4 onward. Beginning with the first DVD releases in the revival era, the show's physical media packages consistently included deleted scenes as bonus features, full-color, fully animated scenes that had been cut from the broadcast versions of specific episodes. These scenes ranged from brief alternate jokes that were trimmed for time to fully developed sequences that were removed for content reasons. They were available to anyone who bought the DVD, making them a genuine secondary archive of what the show had made that didn't make it to air. For fans who cared about the distinction between the broadcast version and the intended version, the DVD extras provided at least a partial answer to the question of what had been left behind. The problem is that this documentation only begins with Season 4. The deleted scenes from Seasons 1, 2, and 3 from the original production run before the show was canceled the first time are largely lost. Not in a legal or institutional sense, not buried in a vault by a corporate decision, but simply lost in the ordinary way that material from productions in the early 2000s gets lost. No one prioritized preserving it. The original production infrastructure for the show was dismantled after the first cancellation, and by the time the revival made preserving the show's early history seem worthwhile, a lot of that material had already become inaccessible. The Lost Media Wiki, a repository for documentation of media that has become unavailable or inaccessible, has an entry dedicated to the deleted scenes from Family Guy's first 3 seasons. What that entry makes clear is that the existence of early season deleted content can be inferred but not accessed. There are production documents, table drafts, script revisions that describe scenes that were written and presumably animated in some form but that never made it to the final broadcast cuts. A scene in which a young Chris Griffin is given his first taste of beer, which was cut from the series premiere Death Has a Shadow, appears in a table draft. A sequence in which the entire Griffin family crashes a 5-person bicycle is described in production notes and visible in a few frames of a behind-the-scenes special that aired when the show was still in its original run. Both the Hanson brothers shotgun scene and the Peter at a party sequence can be inferred from script documents but not viewed in finished animated form. The full-color deleted scenes that exist for Seasons 4 onward include material that illuminates the show's relationship with its own editorial limits in specific and interesting ways. The most frequently discussed of these is a deleted sequence from the Season 2 episode Wasted Talent, in which Stewie breaks into a full musical number titled I've Got a Little List, a parody of the Mikado, in which he catalogs in song the people he intends to execute once his plans for world domination are realized. The number was cut from the broadcast version presumably for a combination of length and the sustained graphic violence of the sequence, in which Stewie's named targets are dispatched with various weapons in animated detail. The DVD restored it, and fans who have seen it tend to agree it is one of the better pieces of writing from the early Stewie Evil Genius era, precisely the kind of material that would have been at home in Season 1 or 2, but that got left behind during the tightening of the episode's runtime. The Season 4 episode Petarded generated a deleted musical number that was cut for reasons that were more explicitly about content. The number, titled Peter is Slow, parodies the telephone hour sequence from the 1963 musical Bye Bye Birdie and depicts the residents of the neighborhood learning by phone chain that Peter has tested as intellectually disabled. The number uses a specific word, the R slur, the clinical term that was once standard language for intellectual disability and has since been broadly recognized as a slur repeatedly enough that the production team determined during the editorial process that the broadcast version could not include it. This is documented in the DVD commentary for the episode. The cut was a content decision, not a time decision. The segment exists as a fully animated deleted scene because it was completed before the content determination was made at a late enough stage that the production had already been through the full animation process. The Season 12 episode Baby Got Black, which was broadcast in 2014, contains in its DVD version a cutaway gag involving Peter as the boyfriend of Norma McCorvey, the real woman who was the plaintiff in Roe v. Wade under the pseudonym Jane Roe, that was cut from the broadcast version. In the cutaway, Peter is present at the Supreme Court when the decision is announced, celebrates with her, then tells her to get that thing out of there and immediately breaks up with her. The gag was included in the DVD release, making it accessible to physical media viewers but absent from any streaming version. The show also reportedly produced, at some point in its middle seasons, an extended version of a particular scene in the episode Partial Terms of Endearment, the very episode that was never aired in the United States that was not included in any official release and reportedly existed only in the context of a production gag, a version of one scene that was produced as an internal joke for the crew that was never intended for any public distribution, and that was subsequently lost to the ordinary attrition of production materials. This version allegedly pushed the content of a specific scene involving Peter and the female doctor, who treats Lois significantly further than the broadcast-approved content would ever permit. It has never been officially acknowledged, and its existence is reported anecdotally by people who claim to have worked on the production. Whether it ever existed in a complete form, and whether it could be located in the current production archives, is simply unknown. The Seasons 1 through 3 material that exists in the most interesting form of partial documentation is the Animatic Archive rough animation drafts using storyboard-level art rather than fully colored and rendered. Animation. Some of this material appeared in the special features of the Freakin' Sweet Collection, released in 2004, the compilation release marketed at hardcore fans. These animatics are not finished products. They are production documents showing the earliest animated interpretations of scenes before the full animation process. Some of the animatics in these early special features contain content that differs from the broadcast versions, in ways that suggest the editing process between animatic and final episode was active, that decisions were made at the animatic review stage to modify or remove material before the full animation pass. The breadth of the gap between what Family Guy made and what it showed goes beyond any specific category of hidden content. The show was produced at high volume over a very long period of time. The ordinary editorial process, across that volume and that time, produces an enormous secondary archive of material that was good enough to animate, but not good enough to keep, or risky enough to remove, or simply too long to fit in a 22-minute episode. Most of this material will never be documented in any comprehensive way. The DVD extras capture some of it for the seasons where the extras were produced. The first 3 seasons exist primarily as gaps, as spaces in the production record where content that was once made has become inaccessible. What sits in the hidden archive of this show is not just the famous buried episodes and the politically charged banned content. It is also the ordinary texture of a show in constant production, the alternate jokes that lost the room in the script reading, the animated sequences that were cut because something else in the episode landed better in the assembly cut, the character moments that got removed because the episode was running long, the musical numbers that were complete productions and then were determined to be expendable. The famous hidden content is documentable. The ordinary hidden content, the texture of 25 years of production, is largely not. Section 10. The Censorship Machine. How Fox and the FCC shaped the show's history. Understanding what Family Guy was not allowed to show requires understanding the institutional architecture that produced all of the decisions we have been examining across this long journey through the show's hidden history. Because the decisions are not arbitrary, and they are not made by any single person acting on personal judgment. They are produced by a layered system of legal constraints, regulatory authority, institutional risk management, advertiser relationships, And the specific culture of standards and practices review that exists in American broadcast television and understanding the system is the only way to understand why the specific decisions that system produced came out the way they did. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has authority under U.S. law to regulate the content of broadcast television during certain hours. The relevant regulatory category is indecency, which the FCC defines as material that describes or depicts sexual or excretory activities or organs in a way that is patently offensive, as measured by contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium. This definition, which emerged from a series of legal cases and regulatory rulings over several decades, establishes a zone of content that broadcast television is prohibited from airing during the hours between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Material that would be permitted on cable television or, now, on streaming platforms can be prohibited on broadcast television if it meets this definition. The regulatory architecture surrounding the FCC's indecency authority means that broadcast networks do not wait for the FCC to review their content and issue a finding of indecency after the fact. They maintain internal standards and practices departments whose function is to review content before broadcast and identify material that could generate FCC complaints or indecency findings. These departments negotiate with show producers about what can and cannot be included in broadcast versions of episodes. They operate as a pre-broadcast filter that shapes what reaches the audience before anyone outside the network has had a chance to complain about anything. Family Guy's relationship with Fox's Standards and Practices Department was one of the defining creative constraints of the show's production for most of its run. MacFarlane has described the relationship at various points as ranging from productive to contentious, depending on which episode and which specific piece of content was being reviewed. The show's writers, by MacFarlane's account and by the accounts of others who worked in the room, regularly developed material with the understanding that some of it would not survive the standards review in its original form. The production process included a negotiation stage where the writers would advocate for specific pieces of content, and the standards reviewers would identify which parts could be cleared and which parts required modification. The PTV episode, which we examined at length earlier, is the most famous example of this negotiation producing a public record of itself, the episode about censorship being itself censored. But the same negotiation happened for material in most episodes. The Conway Twitty running gag, the extended musical performances by the late country singer that appeared multiple times in the middle seasons, as a joke about the show filling time, represented one of the more unusual products of this dynamic, a piece of content so inoffensive from a standards perspective that no aspect of it could be objected to, while being so completely devoid of anything resembling traditional comedy that it functioned as a kind of reverse challenge to the censorship apparatus. The show could not put certain things on television, but it could put a full, unedited Conway Twitty performance on television, and it did, repeatedly, as a demonstration of the absurdity of what the standards review process actually produced. The regulatory climate shifted significantly in the years after the 2004 Super Bowl incident. The FCC under the Bush administration was substantially more aggressive about indecency enforcement in broadcast television than its predecessors had been. The fine increases that Congress passed following the incident from $27,500 to $325,000 per violation created a different financial calculus for network standards departments. Previously, a finding of indecency was an uncomfortable regulatory event with a modest financial penalty attached. After 2004, a finding of indecency in a regularly recurring show could potentially accumulate into very large aggregate fines. The deterrent effect of this change on network content decisions was significant and measurable. MacFarlane signed a deal with Fox in 2008 that was described as worth $100 million over 4 years, making him the highest-paid writer-producer in television at that time. This deal, negotiating his compensation as the creator and voice of the show's main characters, while the show's content relationship with the network was increasingly complicated, illustrates the specific architecture of the creative economy around Family Guy. MacFarlane's financial interests were substantially entangled with the network that he was, on various occasions, publicly criticizing. The show that he was creating content for was being broadcast by an organization that was connected, through shared corporate history and ownership structure, to Fox News, an organization whose political orientation was essentially the opposite of McFarlane's publicly stated views on nearly every political question. In 2020, McFarlane signed a new deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth approximately $200 million over 5 years. This deal moved his production company and his new creative projects away from the Fox ecosystem and into the Comcast network family Peacock, NBC USA. The deal did not end his obligation to voice his characters in Family Guy, because that obligation persisted through the show's Fox contract regardless of where his other creative work went. But it signaled publicly what McFarlane had already signaled in his 2021 tweet comparing his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. The creative and personal alignment between the show's creator and the network broadcasting his show had essentially ended, while the contractual and financial relationship continued because both parties had something to gain from its continuation. The Carol Burnett lawsuit is worth documenting in this section as a specific example of the legal dimension of the censorship machine. Burnett sued Fox over an episode in which the show depicted a version of the character Charwoman, a cleaning lady character that Burnett had played on her variety show in a pornographic environment. Burnett's suit claimed that the depiction infringed her right of publicity and her copyright interest in the Charwoman character. A federal district court dismissed the suit in 2007, ruling that the depiction was protected as parody. The Bourne Company lawsuit over When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was decided in Family Guy's favor in 2009. The Art Matrano suit over a Jesus-performing magic scene from Stewie Griffin. The Untold Story went through extended litigation before eventually being resolved. What this legal history shows is that the censorship machine that shaped Family Guy's content operated on multiple tracks simultaneously. There was the regulatory track of FCC authority and network standards departments shaping what reached the broadcast audience. There was the legal track of intellectual property and right of publicity claims constraining how the show could use real people and existing creative works. And there was the political track, which the partial terms of endearment situation illustrates most clearly, in which the advertiser relationships that funded the show created a set of financial pressures that were ultimately more decisive than any regulatory or legal constraint, because the advertiser relationship determined whether making a specific piece of content was financially rational for the institution doing the broadcasting. The show navigated all of these tracks across 25 years of production. Most of the content that the show wanted to make, it eventually found a way to make. But the archive of what it was not permitted to make the episodes buried, the scenes cut, the shows pulled, the content banned is the record of where that navigation failed. Where the show ran into a constraint that was stronger than its ability to work around or through it, where the institution that held the broadcast rights decided that a specific piece of content was not worth the specific risk it presented and made the corresponding decision to keep it from the audience it was made for. Section 11. Religious controversies and the Jesus episodes. If you had to identify the single category of content that Family Guy returned to more often, more consistently, and with more evident creative appetite than any other, religion would be a strong candidate. The show's engagement with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and God as a character in the show's universe is not occasional. It is structural, woven into the DNA of the show in ways that reflect something genuine about Seth MacFarlane's own relationship to religious belief. He has described himself as an atheist on multiple occasions, and about the specific comedic tradition that Family Guy occupies, which has always understood irreverence towards sacred institutions as one of comedy's most important social functions. The show has depicted God as a recurring character who has a girlfriend named Janet, whom he is not especially faithful to. It has depicted Jesus Christ as a character who shows up in the town where the Griffins live on multiple occasions, works behind the counter of a record store, goes on dates, gets involved in celebrity culture after performing a public miracle, has a drug overdose, and at various points demonstrates that the abilities attributed to him may have been somewhat exaggerated in the historical record. The show has depicted the birth of Jesus in ways that push directly against the devotional treatment that is the normal cultural register for depicting that event. It has made jokes about the crucifixion. It has made jokes about the Pope. It has made jokes about organized religion's relationship with sexuality, with money, with political power, and with the very believers it claims to serve. None of this is accidental. and almost all of it has generated some level of controversy, complaint, FCC petitions, and advertiser pressure. The Parents Television Council, which is the most organized and best funded of the advocacy organizations dedicated to pressuring broadcasters to restrict content, placed Family Guy on its list of worst primetime shows for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The FCC received petitions asking that the show be blocked from broadcasting. Various religious organizations have objected to specific episodes at specific points across the show's run. The episode I Dream of Jesus, from Season 7, is probably the most sustained single-episode engagement with the Jesus character. The premise begins with Peter discovering Jesus working at a record store in the town and recognizing him as Jesus Christ, which Jesus has apparently been hoping someone would do for quite a while, as his anonymity in the contemporary world has been somewhat depressing for him. Peter and Jesus become friends. Peter helps Jesus perform a public miracle, which reignites the world's interest in Jesus, which creates a celebrity dynamic that Jesus finds initially exciting and then thoroughly overwhelming. The episode runs Jesus through the standard celebrity narrative: initial excitement, media saturation, the trap of fame, the drug overdose that is the mandatory celebrity narrative midpoint, the retreat from public life, and at every stage treats him as a character rather than as a sacred figure. He is Jesus Christ who worked at a dead format records and wanted someone to recognize him and is having complicated feelings about being famous again. This episode generated complaints. It also generated, from critics and from the cultural commentariat that evaluates what television is doing with contemporary religion, a degree of genuine engagement with what the show was attempting. The treatment of Jesus as a character who exists in the modern world and has human experiences in it, who finds celebrity overwhelming and performs miracles and gets his feelings hurt when people stop paying attention, is not straightforwardly offensive. It's doing something that has a long tradition in Western art and comedy, taking religious figures out of the protected context of devotion and placing them in situations where they have to respond to the world as it actually is. Whether that tradition is being honored or merely exploited depends on what you believe the purpose of irreverence towards sacred figures actually is. The episode Family Guy, from Season 8, navigates a different set of religious sensitivities. The episode reveals that Lois's mother is Jewish, which makes Lois half-Jewish, which makes the Griffin children technically Jewish, which Peter does not take well. The episode works through the implications of this revelation for the family's religious identity and includes Jesus arriving to clarify matters and, specifically, to confirm that he himself was Jewish, which is of course historically accurate and which Peter also does not take well. The episode is navigating the intersection of Christianity and Judaism in a family comedy context, which has its own specific sensitivities, and it does so in ways that are sometimes sharp and sometimes more blunt than sharp, but that consistently position the comedy in awareness of what it is engaging with. The episode The 2000-Year-Old Virgin, from Season 13, takes the Jesus character in a direction that is more explicitly about sexuality. Peter runs into Jesus at a Christmas shopping event, and the two reconnect. Peter learns that Jesus is still a virgin. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland decide to help Jesus get laid for his birthday. The episode puts Jesus through the typical Family Guy episode structure for this kind of story. Peter has an idea, the idea generates complications, various things go wrong. The episode resolves in a way that has some kind of emotional or comedic logic to it. What the episode is doing with Jesus as a character is stripping away every element of his sacred status and treating him as simply a guy with a problem that Peter Griffin thinks he can solve. The comedy comes from the collision between what Jesus Christ is supposed to represent: divinity, transcendence, the central figure of the world's largest religion, and how he behaves when Peter Griffin is trying to get him a date. The Church of Latter-day Saints has objected to specific episodes that touch on Mormon beliefs. The show's treatment of various aspects of Catholic doctrine has generated organized complaint campaigns at several points. The specifically Jewish dimension of the show's religious comedy is complicated by the fact that a substantial portion of the writing staff in the early and middle seasons was Jewish, the same fact that MacFarlane invoked when defending When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which created a specific dynamic where the show was, at least in part, members of a community making comedy about that community's practices and traditions. This is a genuinely different creative position from outsiders mocking a community from a position of ignorance or hostility, though whether it produces fundamentally different content is something that reasonable people disagree about. What is notable across the full scope of Family Guy's religious comedy is how rarely the institutional response to any of it was outright suppression. The FCC complaints did not produce FCC findings. The advertiser pressure did not generally produce episode bans in the manner of partial terms of endearment. The religious content across 25 seasons has been consistently controversial and has consistently made it to air in something approaching its original form. The exception, the one piece of religious-adjacent content that did get buried and stayed buried, was When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and as we have seen, that burial was ultimately temporary. The institutional system's response to religion, in Family Guy's case, has been mainly to tolerate it while ensuring the most egregious, specific moments were negotiated down through the standards process. This is perhaps because religious comedy, while it generates organized complaint campaigns from advocacy organizations, does not carry the same advertiser risk as some of the other content categories we have examined. Advertisers are sophisticated about what kind of controversy creates actual purchasing impact and what kind generates complaint letters to the network. Religious advocacy organizations have the capacity to organize complaint campaigns, but have historically had more limited capacity to produce advertiser boycotts of the scale that would actually move a network's financial calculations. The calculation that produced the partial terms of endearment ban that the political volatility of abortion in an economically fragile period created unacceptable advertiser risk has simply never applied to the religious comedy in the same way. And so, the religious comedy has been allowed to exist in the broadcast archive in ways that the abortion episode has not. This is not because the religious comedy is less provocative. It is often more provocative. It is because the specific set of financial and political pressures that produces institutional suppression of content is not uniformly distributed across all categories of potentially controversial material. It is shaped by the specific nature of the advocacy organizations involved, the specific demographics of the audience they represent, the specific relationship between that audience and the advertiser base, and the specific economic moment in which the relevant decisions are being made. Family Guy's hidden content is the product of this specific, non-uniform distribution of institutional risk, which is why it looks the way it does, and why the categories of content that got buried are the specific categories they are. Section 12. The Aftermath, Legacy, and What Was Really Lost. We have been traveling for a long time through this story. Through the near death of the show's creator on a morning in September 2001 that changed not just his life, but the life of the country and, as a consequence, the life of the show he had built. Through the first buried episode, the musical number about needing a Jewish accountant that sat in a vault for 3 years while the institutional machinery of broadcast television decided it was too risky to show to the people it was made for. Through the road trip episode and the comedy number, and the airport security scene, and the way that a morning in September 2001 made a joke from May 2000 impossible to look at for 15 years. Through the censorship episode and the censors and the horse trading and the Emmy nomination for an episode that reached its audience already edited by the very forces it was arguing against, through the conspiracy theory and the Boston Marathon and the 9-year absence and the restoration that happened without announcement because enough time had passed that the question answered itself. Through the one episode that America has still never been permitted to see, the one that the network president said was handled well and chose not to show anyway because it was not worth it, the one that aired in the UK to just under 1 million homes and positive reviews, and that still sits unavailable on any American streaming platform more than 15 years later. Through the death stunt and the resurrection, and the 100,000 petition signatures, and the tweet that made clear it had all been a magic trick. Through the deleted scenes and the lost early material and the production gag that may or may not have existed, and the archive that bifurcates between what the show broadcast and what the show intended and what the show was permitted. Through the religious comedy and the institutional tolerance for it, and the non-uniform distribution of risk that explains why Jesus episodes get to air, but abortion episodes do not. What does all of this add up to? What does the complete record of Family Guy's hidden content tell us about the show, about the institutions that broadcast it, and about the relationship between American entertainment and the things American entertainment is permitted to say? The first thing it tells us is that the archive of any long-running television show is not a neutral record. It is a shaped record. It was shaped before the content reached the audience, by the standards review process and the network's editorial judgment and the advertiser relationships that governed what was financially rational to air. It was shaped after the content reached the audience, by the removal of episodes and scenes in response to real-world events that made existing content newly problematic. It was shaped by institutional anxiety about anticipated harm that in many cases turned out to be substantially worse than the actual harm that resulted when the content eventually reached its audience through other channels. The archive that exists, the broadcast record, the streaming catalog, what you can watch when you search for any given episode, is the product of all of these shaping forces operating across more than 25 years of production and distribution decisions. It is not what the show made. It is a version of what the show made that has been filtered through everything the show's institutional environment was willing and able to permit. The second thing it tells us is that the content that gets hidden is not random. It is specifically the content that carries the highest financial and political risk within the specific environment of American broadcast television at specific moments in time. The abortion episode is the purest example. It was not hidden because it was bad. The network president said it was handled well. It was not hidden because it crossed a legal line. No law prohibited its broadcast. It was hidden because the advertiser relationships that funded the broadcast network could not be protected if the episode aired, and the financial logic of broadcast television gave those advertiser relationships more weight than the creative judgment of the people who made the show. The content that gets hidden is the content that the financial infrastructure of American broadcasting finds too expensive to show, measured in terms of advertiser risk rather than quality. The third thing it tells us is that some of the suppression was right, or at least was more defensible than the blanket characterization of censorship suggests. The removal of the Road to Rhode Island bin Laden scene in October of 2001 was not a case of institutional cowardice protecting an advertiser relationship. It was a case of people who were themselves processing collective grief, making a reasonable decision not to put a comedic bin Laden airport scene on television in the weeks after September 11th. The scene's eventual restoration suggests that the removal was appropriate to the moment and did not need to be permanent. Reasonable people can agree that the editorial judgment that produced the removal was defensible, even if they also agree that the editorial judgment that kept the scene off the air for 15 years was excessive. But the fourth thing the record tells us, and this is the one that deserves the most space, is that the content that was hidden and the content that was kept have in common a quality that the institutional decision-making process systematically undervalues. They were both made by people who were trying to say something real about the world. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was made by a Jewish writing staff trying to satirize the specific form that anti-Semitism takes when it is held by someone who does not even understand that he is holding a prejudice. The Road to Rhode Island airport scene was a piece of airport security satire, made in a world where airport security was genuinely inadequate. Partial Terms of Endearment was made by Danny Smith, who had read a Carl Sagan essay about moral philosophy and the abortion debate, trying to dramatize the actual complexity of that question in a form that 14-year-old boys watching late-night animation might actually engage with. Life of Brian was made by people who genuinely wanted to test whether the show could do something it had never done, commit to a permanent loss, and discovered that they could not go through with it. All of these things were worth making. Some of them were also worth showing. Some of them, at the moment they were made, the institutions responsible for showing them decided were not worth the risk, and so they went into the archive in its various forms: the legal vault, the DVD deleted scenes collection, the UK broadcast schedule, the streaming catalog of most countries except one, and the audience was protected from them. What was really lost in all of this is harder to quantify than any individual episode or scene. What was lost is the full version of a conversation that Family Guy was always trying to have with its audience. A conversation about American life and American culture and American politics and American religion and American family, dynamics and American entertainment and the extraordinary mess of all of it that kept getting interrupted and edited and redirected and occasionally shut down entirely by the specific machinery of American institutional entertainment. The show kept trying to say certain things, and the system kept finding specific reasons why certain of those things could not be said at that moment, in that form, on that platform. Some of those reasons were principled. Most of them were financial. A few of them were the product of real-world events that nobody could have anticipated or prevented. And the result is the archive that exists, a record of an extraordinary, maddening, inconsistent, genuinely ambitious show that made more content than it was permitted to show, that hid more behind its broadcast history than most of its audience ever knew was there, and that spent 25 years and more navigating the specific territory between what it wanted to say and what American broadcast television would allow it to say. That territory is the subject of this long story. And documenting it completely, every buried episode, every cut scene, every banned piece of content, every moment when the institutional machinery produced a version of the show that was less than what the show had tried to be, is itself a way of honoring what the show was attempting, even in the cases where the attempt was uneven or the content was imperfect or the creative judgment was questionable. It is a way of insisting that the record be complete, that the version of the show that exists in the broadcast archive not be mistaken for the complete version of what the show was trying to do. Family Guy tried to do more than it was allowed to show you. This has been the record of what it tried. The full scope of what this show built and buried and was prevented from finishing, and occasionally rescued from the vault years after the moment that produced the burial had passed. It is genuinely one of the more interesting documents of what American broadcast television looked like across the first quarter of the 21st century, not just as entertainment history, as a record of what the institutions that deliver entertainment to the American public were and were not willing to stand behind, measured not in principles stated but in decisions made, one episode at a time, across 25 years of production and all the hidden content that production generated. That content is here now, in the archive, some of it officially, some of it only in certain regions, some of it only on physical media, some of it only in the memories of the people who saw it once in its original broadcast context before it was removed, some of it lost to the ordinary passage of time and the attrition of production materials that nobody thought to preserve. All of it part of the complete picture of what Family Guy actually was. Closing, if you made it here to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. These long, deep explorations into the hidden histories of shows and worlds that shaped our culture take real time to put together and real attention to get through. The fact that you stayed for all of it means something. If anything in here surprised you, or if there is a specific chapter of this that you want to see explored in its own dedicated video, drop that in the comments. Drop anything in the comments. The community this channel has grown around these long, slow, atmospheric deep dives is one of the best parts of doing this work. Seeing where in the world people are watching from, what time it is where you are, what brought you to a video like this on a night like this, it matters. If you are not subscribed, this is the moment. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it is the most direct way to tell this channel that you want more of this kind of content: long, careful, thoroughly researched, atmospheric storytelling about the hidden histories and the buried moments and the things that almost happened but did not. There is more of this coming. A lot more. Like the video if it earned it. And if you have been here since the beginning of this one, you have. More soon? Expanded. The full history of the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein battle. The story of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein contains within it a specific and under-examined detail that explains quite a lot about how Family Guy's relationship with its own creative limits was established in its first 2 years. Seth MacFarlane, before a single page of script had been submitted to network review, showed the episode to 2 rabbis. This is not something that television creators typically do with their scripts before production. It is not standard industry practice. The fact that MacFarlane did it tells you something about how seriously he took the question of whether the episode was doing what he thought it was doing, and whether the community most directly implicated by the episode's content would recognize in it what he intended. The 2 rabbis who reviewed the episode both gave it their approval. Their reasoning was, as MacFarlane later described it, grounded in exactly the argument he was making. The episode's moral is delivered without ambiguity by Lois, who tells Peter directly that success has nothing to do with religion, and that his belief to the contrary is a prejudice. Peter holds a wrong belief. The episode knows it is wrong. The audience is positioned to know it is wrong. The character who most clearly expresses the correct moral view delivers that view in the episode's climactic sequence. This is the structure of satire. The prejudice being depicted is the object of criticism, not the subject of endorsement. Fox received the episode with the rabbi approvals and the production team's defense, and declined to air it anyway. The network's reasoning never fully articulated in any single public document but reconstructed from various accounts centered on the extractability problem that we noted earlier. The specific content of the I Need a Jew number, in the context of the post-2000 media environment, where clips circulated rapidly through email forwarding and early internet sharing platforms, was judged to be too vulnerable to being taken out of context. A clip of a cartoon character singing a song with that title, without the surrounding episode that established the satirical frame, was exactly the kind of content that could generate a news cycle that Fox did not want to be at the center of. This reasoning is worth examining carefully because it recurs, in various forms, throughout the history of Family Guy's hidden content. It is not the reasoning of people who believe the content is wrong. It is the reasoning of people who believe that the content is right, but that the institutional context in which they operate makes showing it financially and reputationally risky. The distinction matters because it means the institutional suppression of content is rarely about moral judgment, about the network deciding that the audience should not see something because seeing it would harm them. It is almost always about financial judgment, about the network deciding that airing something would harm the network's business relationships in ways that the revenue generated by airing it would not compensate for. The 3 years during which When You Wish Upon a Weinstein sat in the vault were not 3 years during which Fox reconsidered its moral position on the episode. They were 3 years during which the show was canceled, revived on Adult Swim, generated the audience numbers and DVD sales that convinced Fox to bring it back for a 4th season, and during which the general media environment shifted enough that when Adult Swim offered to air the episode, Fox found themselves in a different calculation. Adult Swim's audience, the late-night cable audience that had made Family Guy the highest-rated show on their block, had already demonstrated that it would watch Family Guy enthusiastically and without the kind of widespread negative reaction that Fox had been preemptively protecting against. When Adult Swim aired the episode in November 2003 and the anticipated catastrophe did not materialize, the data that Fox had been managing around was substantially revised. The Bourne Company lawsuit that followed the episode's airing added a specific dimension to this story that has not always received the attention it deserves. The Bourne Company is the publishing house that owns the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, the song from the 1940 Pinocchio that I Need a Jew parodies. The lawsuit they filed in 2007 argued, in essence, that the parody had damaged the original song's value and reputation by associating it with offensive content. This argument carries within it a specific theory of how parody should work, that a parody which uses a revered and beloved original as the vehicle for offensive content cannot claim the protection of fair use because the offense is too extreme to be balanced by the transformative purpose of the parody. United States District Judge Deborah Batts rejected this argument with a ruling that is worth reading in its entirety for anyone who wants to understand how American copyright law approaches parody. The ruling observed that the comic potential of I Need a Jew depended precisely on the audience's familiarity with the original song's associations with innocence, with magical thinking, with the specific emotional register of Disney animation. The gap between what the original meant and what Peter was singing about was the engine of the comedy. This is exactly what parody is supposed to do. The more powerful and beloved the original, the more effective the parody that subverts it, which means that the Bourne Company's argument that associating its song with offensive content damaged its value was in tension with the basic creative logic of parody as a form. The ruling was a vindication for McFarlane and for the episode's writers, but it was a vindication that arrived 8 years after the episode was originally produced and more than 5 years after it had first aired on Adult Swim. The legal resolution of the question came long after the question had been answered practically. The episode was out in the world. It had been received without the catastrophe Fox had anticipated, and the copyright lawsuit had become a secondary fight about legal principle rather than a live threat to the episode's existence. What When You Wish Upon a Weinstein ultimately illustrates is the specific shape of institutional risk management in American broadcast television at the turn of the millennium. A show could be made by Jewish writers. It could be reviewed by rabbis. It could have its moral and satirical intention clearly legible in its text. And none of those things were sufficient to overcome the institutional calculation that the clip extractability risk was too high, the potential advertiser reaction was too uncertain, and the overall financial exposure of airing it in 2000 exceeded the value of the broadcast. The calculus changed when the environment changed. Not because anyone changed their mind about whether the episode was good or whether the satire was legitimate, because the data about what the audience was actually willing to watch and what the practical consequences of showing them things that made them uncomfortable actually looked like in terms of business impact had been substantially revised by 3 years of Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales figures. This pattern institutional risk management producing content suppression, followed by the data revising the risk calculation, followed by the suppression eventually lifting, is visible in several of the cases we have examined in this story. It is the optimistic reading of how the system eventually rights itself. The hidden content finds its way to the audience through channels that are less constrained than the original broadcast environment. The audience responds in ways that the institutional fear had predicted incorrectly, and the suppression becomes harder to justify. The pessimistic reading is also visible. In the case of Partial Terms of Endearment, no such revision has occurred. The episode found its audience in the UK and on DVD. The American broadcast and streaming market found reasons to maintain the suppression anyway. And 15 years on, with the political context around abortion having changed dramatically in ways that make the subject more urgent rather than less, the episode remains inaccessible through the channels where most American viewers would look for it. The gap between these two outcomes, the Weinstein episode eventually emerging from its vault and the abortion episode remaining in its, is not explained by any difference in the quality or legitimacy of the content. It is explained by the specific nature of the institutional risk each episode posed and by whether the passage of time revised that risk calculation or left it intact. Religious and ethnic humor, even when initially suppressed, has a path back to air because the advocacy organizations that object to it do not have the sustained advertiser leverage that makes their objections financially decisive over the long term. Political content on the most politically divisive subject in American political life operates in a different market. The calculation that produced the Partial Terms of Endearment ban is tied to a political reality that has not changed enough in the specific way that matters to American broadcast television's advertiser relationships to produce a different calculation today. Expanded, the full context of the Brian death controversy and what it revealed. The specific editorial decision that makes the Brian Griffin death situation so interesting to examine at length is not the decision to kill him. It is the decision to destroy Stewie's time machine in the same episode before killing him. This is the decision that makes the death look permanent. This is the decision that makes the grief the audience feels real rather than provisional. And this is the decision that reveals, retrospectively, how carefully the production team had thought through exactly what emotional response they were trying to produce. Think about what Stewie's time machine represents within the internal logic of Family Guy's universe. It is the show's primary mechanism for undoing consequences, for reversing the irreversible, for resetting situations that have gotten too far out of control, for giving the show a way out of narrative positions that would otherwise be permanent. The time machine is the ultimate deus ex machina, the device that the show has used to get itself out of impossible situations across multiple seasons and multiple episodes. For a show that has always been allergic to permanent consequences, the time machine is the institutional expression of that allergy. Any consequence can be undone as long as the machine exists. By destroying the time machine before Brian is killed, the production team was explicitly removing the safety net. They were saying to the audience, in structural terms, the thing we would normally use to undo this is gone. This death is going to be different from all the other impossible situations we have put these characters in, because the mechanism we would normally use to reverse it has been eliminated. The destruction of the time machine is not a character beat about Stewie deciding to live in the present, or rather, it is that. But it is also simultaneously a piece of audience management, a signal that the normal rules do not apply to what is about to happen. And then the normal rules did apply. Stewie found another time machine. he went back and saved Brian. The mechanism that had been ostentatiously destroyed in order to make the death feel permanent was replaced by a different instance of the same mechanism from a parallel timeline. The structural signal that the production team had sent this is going to be different turned out to be false. The death was undone. The time machine in some form remained available. The show's fundamental allergy to permanent consequences was never really going to be overcome by the death of a main character, because the show could not actually commit to the consequences of what it had done. This reveals something specific about the creative position that Family Guy had reached by season 12. The show wanted the benefits of dramatic narrative, the emotional investment, the press coverage, the engagement metrics, the sense that the story mattered without being willing to accept the costs of dramatic narrative, which is the actual irreversibility of significant events. It wanted the audience to believe that something permanent had happened, while simultaneously making arrangements to ensure that nothing permanent had actually happened. The stunt was perfectly designed to produce the desired short-term outcome: enormous engagement, trending hashtags, record petition growth, and the reversal was perfectly designed to let the show have its normal functioning afterward without any of the permanent consequences that would have required actually committing to what it had done. MacFarlane's tweet after the restoration? I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be fucking high, is often cited as the moment that crystallized fan anger about the whole situation. And it is worth examining why this specific framing landed so badly for many viewers. The tweet positions the entire event as so obviously a stunt that being emotionally invested in it was naive. It suggests that anyone who signed the petition or grieved the death was, in some sense, the mark in the trick, rather than a genuine participant in an emotional experience. The show was inviting. It retroactively reframes the grief as gullibility, and it does so in the specific tone of light mockery you didn't really think, Jesus, we'd have to be high, that makes the dismissal feel contemptuous of the attachment rather than grateful for it. The fact that MacFarlane also said, in the same period, that the production team was genuinely surprised by the intensity of the fan reaction, that the rage was not something they counted on, creates a specific tension with the tweet. If the stunt was so obviously a stunt that being upset about it was naive, why was the production team surprised by how upset people were? The answer is that neither statement is fully true. The production team knew it was a stunt that would generate significant engagement. They did not expect the specific form and intensity of the negative engagement to be as large as it was. The tweet was MacFarlane retreating to a position of controlled confidence about the situation after the situation had produced results that exceeded his predictions, a way of reasserting creative authority over an event that had generated more authentic emotional investment than the production had fully prepared for. The most interesting counterfactual question in this whole situation is the one that the SlashFilm.com writer raised in a retrospective. What if the show had committed? What if Life of Brian had aired in November 2013 as the first episode of a genuine sustained story about what Family Guy looked like without Brian Griffin? What if Vinny had been given a full season 12 or 15 episodes to establish himself as a character, to develop a different kind of relationship with Stewie, to demonstrate whether the show could function as something other than the thing it had always been? What if the question that the death raised, which is really the question of whether Family Guy was a show that was capable of growth, capable of the kind of permanent consequence that long-running dramatic storytelling requires, had been taken seriously rather than used as a stunt? The show never answered that question. It got as far as asking it ostentatiously, with the structural preparation of the time machine's destruction making clear that it understood what permanent consequence would require, and then it pulled back. Vinny exists in the archive for approximately 2 episodes. His voice, Tony Sirico's specific and distinctive Sopranos energy, had a genuine comedic potential that the show never developed. The Brian-Stewie friendship, which had become one of the show's defining creative partnerships, was never seriously renegotiated with a different character in one of those positions. The show chose to restore what it had rather than to find out what it could have been. Expanded, the South Park feud, and what it revealed about cutaway culture. The 2-part South Park episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in April of 2006, is not just a piece of Family Guy criticism. It is the most articulate public statement by a competing show about what was wrong with Family Guy's creative approach, delivered in the specific language of animation and at a moment when both shows were at the height of their cultural visibility. The premise of the Cartoon Wars episodes is that Family Guy has announced an upcoming episode in which the Prophet Muhammad will be depicted, and the question of whether that episode should air, given the obvious real-world sensitivities around depicting Muhammad in any context, which the 2005 Gillen's Poston cartoon controversy had made urgently visible, becomes the narrative engine of the story. But within that story, Trey Parker and Matt Stone include an extended satirical treatment of how Family Guy's jokes are actually produced. The show depicts Family Guy's writing process as being handled by a room full of manatees who live in a tank and randomly push labeled balls, idea balls, together. The manatees gather balls at random, combine them, and the combination produces a cutaway gag. One manatee pushes a Peter Griffin ball together with an old man ball and a sewing machine ball, and the result is, you know what's better than sewing? Not sewing. Cue random cutaway. The specific satirical claim here is that Family Guy's cutaway gags are not the product of any intentional creative relationship between the gag and the episode context. They could be placed anywhere, in any episode, in any sequence, and nothing would change, because they are not connected to anything. They are generated by a process that is essentially random, the arbitrary combination of unrelated elements, and presented as comedy through the convention of the cutaway format, which the audience has been trained to accept as a comedic unit regardless of its actual relationship to the surrounding content. Parker and Stone have said publicly, in multiple interviews, that they do not respect Family Guy's writing. After the Cartoon Wars episodes aired, the Wall Street Journal reported that they had received phone calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanking them for the episodes. This is a detail that should not be glossed over. Writers from two of the other major animated comedies on Fox's own Animation Domination lineup called the South Park creators to thank them for publicly criticizing the show. They all shared a network with. This suggests that the critique was not just the position of a competing show, but something close to an industry consensus among the professional animation community that was watching Family Guy become the most commercially dominant show. In their space, McFarlane's response to the Cartoon Wars episodes has been characteristically measured in public. He has said that the manatee joke was somewhat fair and somewhat not, depending on which season of the show you were evaluating. This is actually a fairly honest self-assessment. The early season cutaways were genuinely clever. They were specific, they were connected to the episode context in meaningful ways, they were written with a relationship between the setup and the punchline that required someone to have thought about what they were doing. The later season cutaways drifted toward the condition the manatee joke described. The joke was not uniformly true about the show's entire history. But it was true enough about the show's trajectory that it stuck, that it became the dominant critical framework for understanding what was happening to Family Guy as its seasons accumulated. What the Cartoon Wars feud really revealed, and what subsequent developments in the show's history confirmed, is that the cutaway gag as a structural format is a tool that punishes creative laziness more severely than almost any other tool in television comedy. Done well, it requires the same quality of thought and intention as any other form of joke construction. Done lazily, it becomes the most visible possible demonstration of laziness, because the randomness that makes a bad cutaway bad is on full display in a way that a bad line of dialogue is not. A bad line can be obscured by performance or context. A bad cutaway reveals exactly what it is: an absence of connection between what was said in the story and what appeared on screen as a result. The show knew this. The self-referential jokes about the cutaway format episodes that parody the show's own reliance on it, characters who acknowledge the format's absurdity, are evidence that the writers were aware of the critique and were engaging with it as content. Whether engaging with a critique as content is the same as addressing the underlying creative problem is a question that different people will answer differently. The cutaway format remained central to the show's approach to comedy throughout its entire run. The ratio of excellent cutaways to lazy ones shifted over time in the direction that the manatee joke predicted. And the show kept going anyway, because the format's capacity to generate short clips that could be shared online and generate engagement metrics remained one of its most valuable assets in the specific economics of content in the internet age. Family Guy's cutaway gags were, in a genuine sense, optimized for the social media environment before social media as we know it existed. The 30-second self-contained comedy unit, easily clipped, easily shared, easily consumed without any context for the episode it came from, was exactly what YouTube needed to build a content library when it launched in 2005, the same year the show came back from its cancellation. The show that Trey Parker and Matt Stone were criticizing for producing interchangeable random content was simultaneously producing some of the most shareable content in the early history of online video. The manatee joke was right about the show's creative method and did not predict how successfully that method would translate to a new distribution environment. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth in the entire history of the show's creative decline. The things that made it worse as television made it better as internet content. The short, disconnected, shareable clip became increasingly central to how people encountered and consumed Family Guy. An audience that had never sat through a full episode knew the show through specific clips. An audience that had once watched it as a story, watched it as a collection of moments. The cutaway format, which originated as a supplement to storytelling, became the primary product in the digital distribution environment, and the storytelling that had originally given the cutaways, their context became secondary, something to get through between the moments that were actually going to get clipped and shared. The show that is hidden from us, the show that made more than it was permitted to show, the show that buried its most challenging content in legal vaults and standards review compromises and advertiser sensitivity calculations, was also, simultaneously, the show that found a new form of visibility in the clip economy of the internet that the original broadcast show had never had access to. The two things coexist in the history of Family Guy without resolving each other. The show got harder to watch as a complete thing and easier to consume as a collection of moments at the same time. The hidden content accumulated as the shareable content multiplied. And the full picture of what the show was, everything it made and was prevented from showing and eventually showed anyway and was not permitted to show at all, became, across 25 years, one of the more complicated documents in the history of American television comedy. The broader legacy. What Family Guy's hidden archive tells us about television itself. The story of what Family Guy was not allowed to show you is, in the end, not just a story about Family Guy. It is a story about the specific architecture of American broadcast television as an institution, about how that institution is funded, what constraints that funding model imposes on the content it distributes, and what happens when a creative team is committed enough to producing content that pushes against those constraints to generate a record of the collision. The funding model is the key to understanding everything. American broadcast television is funded by advertising revenue. Advertising revenue is generated by selling access to audiences to companies that want to reach those audiences. The company's willingness to pay for that access depends on a variety of factors, of which audience size is obviously central but is not the only variable. Brand association is also central. An advertiser does not just want to reach a large audience, it wants to reach that audience in a context that does not damage its brand. A pharmaceutical company selling a medication to elderly viewers does not want its advertisement sandwiched around content that generates news coverage, accusing the network of airing something offensive. The association between the content and the advertising shapes how the advertising is received, and in extreme cases, it shapes whether the advertiser is willing to be associated with the content at all. This means that the practical limit on what any broadcast television show can produce and air is set not by the regulatory limit of FCC authority, though that authority creates a floor, and not by the ethical judgment of the production team or the network executive, though that judgment shapes many individual decisions. The practical limit is set by the advertiser relationship, and the advertiser relationship is not governed by any principle more abstract than the financial interests of the companies involved in it. An advertiser will tolerate content that generates controversy if the controversy does not measurably damage the advertiser's brand or relationships with its customers. An advertiser will withdraw from content that generates the specific kind of controversy that creates customer pressure on the advertiser, directly boycott campaigns, organize complaint campaigns directed at the advertiser's customer base, news coverage that places the advertiser's name in proximity to the content controversy. This is the specific calculation that produced the partial terms of endearment ban. Kevin Riley said explicitly that the ban was about advertisers and financial sensitivity, not about the content's quality. He said the episode handled the subject well. He said the economy was struggling. He said advertisers were cautious. He said it was not worth it. This is a broadcasting executive telling you, in plain language, that the content of a television show is secondary to the financial relationships that fund its broadcast. The content can be good. The content can be responsible. The content can be exactly what the creator wanted it to be and what a critic would praise and what a substantial portion of the audience would value. And it can still be suppressed, because the financial infrastructure that makes the broadcast possible has determined that the risk of association with that content outweighs the value of airing it. What the hidden archive of Family Guy reveals about this system is not that the system is corrupt in any simple sense. The advertiser relationship funds an enormous amount of free content that reaches an enormous audience. The regulatory framework that the FCC administers exists because broadcast television uses public airwaves that are held in trust for the public interest. The standards review process that shapes what reaches the broadcast audience operates as an institutional buffer that has, on various occasions, prevented content from airing that the audience would have found genuinely harmful. None of these elements of the system is straightforwardly wrong. They are all, in their own terms, defensible. What the Family Guy archive reveals is that the aggregate effect of these defensible individual elements is a content environment that systematically undervalues creative ambition and systematically overvalues financial risk. Management, a system that says, in practice, content that takes real risks with real subjects will be less likely to reach its intended audience than content that manages those risks out of the production process before they can generate institutional discomfort. The show's most important hidden content, partial terms of endearment above all, but also When You Wish Upon a Weinstein before it, and the Road to Rhode Island Bin Laden scene, and the Turban Cowboy removal is not content that failed. It is content that succeeded in doing what it was trying to do and was suppressed anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with its success or failure as creative work. The abortion episode is the clearest case. A network president said it was handled well and declined to air it. This is the system working exactly as it was designed to work, and the result is that the most carefully considered and most responsible engagement with one of the most important moral and political questions in American life that an animated comedy has ever attempted remains unavailable to American viewers 15 years after it was made. This matters beyond Family Guy. Every long-running television show that is operated within the same institutional environment has generated its own version of this archive, its own collection of content that was made and suppressed or altered or never fully realized because the financial and regulatory constraints of American broadcast television made it too expensive or too risky to show. The Family Guy archive is unusually well documented because the show was unusually committed to making things that pushed against those constraints and unusually willing to fight publicly for the content when it was suppressed. But the pattern it documents is not unique to the show. It is the pattern of American broadcast television across the decades that produced it. What we can say from the record that this long examination has assembled is this: Family Guy made more than it was permitted to show. It made things that were good, and things that were bad, and things that were somewhere in between, and the selection among those things that ultimately reached the audience was shaped not primarily by quality, but by financial and regulatory risk. The content that was hidden was sometimes hidden for defensible reasons, and sometimes hidden for reasons that are difficult to defend on any grounds except the institutional self-interest of the organization doing the hiding. The content that eventually found its way out of hiding found its way through channels Adult Swim, DVD releases, UK broadcasting, streaming restoration years after the original suppression that operated with different constraints from those that governed the original broadcast decisions. And the content that remains hidden, still unavailable, still missing from the American streaming catalog, still suppressed by the same institutional calculation that initially produced the suppression, is the most honest testimony available about what the financial infrastructure of American entertainment is and is not willing to stand behind. Measured not in mission statements or press releases, but in decisions. One episode at a time, over 25 years. Across a body of work that was, at its best, one of the most genuinely ambitious and genuinely risky things that American network television produced in the period between its premiere in 1999 and the present day. That is the archive. That is the record. That is what Family Guy made and could not show you. and what the gap between those two things tells us about the world in which both things exist: the production culture and the voices behind the scenes. There is one more dimension of Family Guy's hidden history that deserves space before we close: the people who made it. Not the executives who made the suppression decisions, and not MacFarlane as the face of the creative operation, but the writers and directors and voice actors and animators who actually produced the episodes, the specific individuals whose creative work populated the archive we have been examining. The writing room of Family Guy, across its various seasons and incarnations, included a remarkably diverse group of people whose individual voices and sensibilities contributed to the specific character of the show's content in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. Ricky Blitt, who wrote When You Wish Upon a Weinstein and who is Jewish, brought a specific and grounded perspective on Jewish American cultural stereotyping that is legible in the episode's specific satirical approach. Danny Smith, who wrote Partial Terms of Endearment after reading a Carl Sagan essay about moral philosophy, brought a genuine intellectual engagement with the abortion debate that is visible in the episode's unusual care with how both sides of the argument are represented. Gary Janetti, who wrote Road to Rhode Island, brought a specific comedic sensibility that produced what is widely regarded as one of the best individual episodes in the show's history. These writers worked inside a system that they did not fully control, a system of network standards review and advertiser relationships and executive editorial judgment that shaped what ultimately reached the audience. They made things that were suppressed. They made things that were altered by the standards process. They made things that were aired in forms that differed from what they had written. They also made things that got through intact, that said exactly what they intended, that found audiences who recognized in them something real and funny and occasionally genuinely important. The voice cast who brought these characters to life across 25 years did so in conditions that were, by most accounts, unusually demanding. Seth MacFarlane voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, simultaneously 4 of the show's 6 main characters, each with a distinct voice and characterization, sometimes in the same scene, requiring him to alternate between voices in real time in the recording booth. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, famously had to fight to keep her job in the show's early period, re-auditioning after Fox's initial network pass on the pilot suggested the network wanted to replace her. She won the re-audition. Her performance of Lois across the show's entire run is, by the testimony of critics and fans, one of the things that makes the character work. The specific combination of warmth and exasperation and occasional darkness that Borstein brings to the role makes Lois a character worth caring about even as the show's later seasons gave her less to do. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg Griffin since season 2, has spoken publicly about the experience of being associated with a character defined by relentless abuse and social rejection. She described strangers coming up to her and repeating the catchphrase that became associated with Peter's dismissiveness toward Meg in later seasons. She brought a quality of genuine pathos to Meg in the episodes that allowed the character moments of real feeling, and her performances in episodes like Seahorse Seashell Party, in which Meg finally confronts the family about how they have treated her, have genuine emotional weight that the character's subsequent return to the status quo makes more painful in retrospect, not less. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, brought the character's distinctive vocal quality from an audition that involved him doing an impression of the serial killer Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs as an 11-year-old. This detail is simultaneously very specific and very Family Guy, the exact kind of unexpected creative decision that produced the show at its most interesting, where someone made an unusual choice that should not have worked, and the people responsible for the casting decision recognized that it worked and went with it. The voice of Chris Griffin has its origins in a Silence of the Lambs audition gag. The show produced so many of its best moments from exactly this kind of creative accident. The animation studios that handled the show's production across its various seasons, Rough Draft Studios for much of the original run, various Korean animation studios for later seasons, contributed a visual aesthetic that changed over time in ways that fans noticed and commented on, associating specific animation styles with specific eras of the show's quality. The rougher, more fluid, more expressive animation of the early seasons is often cited by fans as part of what made those seasons feel alive in a way that the cleaner, more rigid animation of later seasons did not. This is a quality that is difficult to articulate and easy to recognize when you go back and watch episodes from different periods side by side. Something about the earlier animation made the characters feel like they were capable of surprise. The later animation made them feel like they were following a template. All of these people, the writers, the voice cast, the animators, the directors contributed to a show that was, at its best, genuinely extraordinary, and that accumulated behind it a hidden archive that is, in its own way, equally extraordinary. The archive is not just a record of suppression, it is a record of creative ambition. Of people who made things they believed in and were prevented from showing them, and who went on making things anyway, in the conviction that some of it would find its audience eventually, through whatever channels were available, regardless of what the institutional environment of American broadcast television determined was worth airing in any given week. That conviction produced some of the most interesting content in the history of American animated comedy. It produced the buried episodes and the cutscenes and the banned hour of television and the death stunt that broke the internet for 3 weeks, and the expanded archive of deleted musical numbers and the lost footage from 3 seasons of original production and all the other pieces of the hidden history that this long exploration has tried to document completely. The show that made all of that is still going. Family Guy has been renewed through its 27th season. Seth MacFarlane will continue to provide the voices. New writers will continue to develop episodes. The standards review process will continue to shape what reaches the broadcast audience. The advertiser relationships will continue to exercise their quiet editorial authority over what is and is not financially rational to air. The gap between what the show makes and what the show is permitted to show will continue to exist, and will continue to produce its own archive of hidden content in whatever forms the current institutional environment creates. And somewhere in that ongoing production, across however many more seasons the show runs, there will be more content like this. More episodes that push harder than the system can accommodate. More scenes that survive to the DVD but not the broadcast. More moments that air once and are quietly removed. More material that reaches some audiences but not others. That finds its way through certain channels but not the primary one. That exists in the archive without existing in the version of the archive that most viewers would think to look at. The hidden archive of Family Guy is not finished. It will not be finished as long as the show keeps going. And documenting it, all of it, comprehensively, with the detail and the context each piece deserves, is the ongoing project of anyone who wants to understand what this show actually was, as opposed to what its broadcast record says it was. Tonight, in this very long journey through all of it, we have tried to document it as completely as the available record permits. What is here is as complete a picture as can currently be assembled of what Family Guy made and could not show you. The international dimension, Venezuela, global bans, and the show overseas. The story of Family Guy's hidden content in the United States is the primary story of this video, but it is not the complete story. The show has been subject to broadcast restrictions, temporary bans, regulatory responses, and content disputes in multiple countries beyond the United States, and some of these international cases illuminate aspects of the show's contentious relationship with its own content that the American cases do not fully capture. The Venezuela case is the most politically unusual of these. The Season 7 episode 420, written as a reference to the date April 20th, and centered on Brian's campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town where the Griffins live, aired on Fox in the United States on the 19th of April, 2009. The episode generated the usual range of domestic responses. Some critics found it an effective use of the show's satirical mode for engaging with drug policy, others found it uneven, and the Parents Television Council objected to the episode's treatment of marijuana use. What nobody anticipated was the Venezuelan government's response. Lara Garcia Jutglar, who was Venezuela's justice minister at the time under President Hugo Chavez, identified the episode as an example of what she characterized as American promotion of drug use through entertainment media, and issued warnings to Venezuelan cable networks that they would face fines if they continued to air Family Guy. The networks complied and pulled the show from their schedules. Family Guy was effectively banned from Venezuelan cable television as a direct consequence of a single episode about marijuana legalization. The specifics of this situation are worth sitting with for a moment. A cartoon about a talking dog and his fictional family arguing about drug policy in a fictional American town was the subject of a regulatory intervention by a South American government that resulted in the show being pulled from that country's broadcast schedules. This is an extreme version of a phenomenon that is more common than most people realize. American entertainment content being understood in completely different ways in different political and cultural contexts. What reads as satire in one context reads as propaganda in another. What functions as irreverent comedy in the cultural register that produced it functions as something else entirely when received in a context with different assumptions about what entertainment is and what it is for. The Venezuelan ban was not permanent. The show eventually returned to Venezuelan schedules as the political context shifted, and the episode itself exists in the show's catalog without any specific modification for different markets. But the incident documented something that American discussions of Family Guy's controversial content rarely address. The show's cultural assumptions are specifically and deeply American, and those assumptions do not translate neutrally into other cultural contexts. The jokes about marijuana legalization that register as political satire within an American context register differently in countries where the drug policy discourse operates in a different framework, and where the relationship between entertainment media and political messaging is understood very differently. The UK, which, as we have already documented, was the country where partial terms of endearment received its only legitimate broadcast, represents the other end of this spectrum. A country with a different regulatory framework for broadcast content, a different political culture around some of the subjects the show engages with, and as a consequence, a different set of editorial decisions about which Family Guy content is and is not appropriate for its audience. The BBC Three broadcast of the abortion episode is not evidence that the UK is more permissive about content in general. British broadcasting has its own extensive regulatory framework and its own content restrictions. It is evidence that the specific political and cultural weight that abortion carries in the American context, where it has been the central front of a culture war for decades, does not attach to it in the same way in the UK broadcasting environment. Australia has aired versions of Family Guy episodes that include content modified for American broadcast, and has also aired some content that did not air in the US. The show's Australian broadcast history is complicated by the fact that Australian censorship frameworks treat some categories of content differently from American ones, resulting in an Australian archive of the show that differs in specific ways from both the American broadcast archive and the UK archive. The show exists, in other words, not as a single fixed object, but as a set of versions that differ by market, by distribution channel, and by the specific regulatory and cultural environment in which it is being received. This is the hidden dimension of Family Guy's international distribution that most American viewers never think about. The show they watch on Hulu or on Fox is one version of the show. The show that aired on BBC Three is another. The show that was available in Australia before certain content decisions were made is another. The show that Venezuelan cable networks stopped airing in 2009 and eventually brought back is another. All of these are the same production, the same animation, the same voice performances, the same scripts, but they exist in archives that differ from each other in specific and sometimes significant ways. The aggregate of all these different archives, in all their different national and regional and platform-specific forms, constitutes something like the full record of what Family Guy is. No single national archive contains all of it. The American archive, which is the most extensively documented and the most discussed, is missing specific episodes and scenes that exist in other markets. The UK archive contains an episode that the American archive does not. The DVD archive contains content that no broadcast archive of any country contains in its broadcast version. The streaming archive is a further selection from the broadcast archive, missing some content that was available in broadcast and sometimes restoring content that had been removed from broadcast. Understanding Family Guy, completely understanding what the show actually is, as distinct from the version of it that any particular viewer has encountered, requires engaging with this distributed, fragmented, market-specific, platform-specific archive in its full complexity. This video has focused primarily on the American archive and the American institutional decisions that shaped it, because that is where the most significant hidden content is located and where the most interesting institutional story lies. But the international dimension adds a further layer to the story. The show's content is not just hidden in America. It is variously present and absent and modified across every market where it has ever aired. And the complete record of what it is would require assembling all of those versions into a composite that no single viewer has ever actually experienced. What we can say is this: the show that premiered on the 31st of January, 1999, to 22 million viewers after Super Bowl 33, has, over 25 years, produced a body of work that exists in more forms, in more versions, in more institutional conditions of presence and absence than almost any other animated comedy in television history. The famous episodes exist in multiple versions simultaneously. The banned episodes exist in some markets and not others. The deleted scenes exist in physical media and not in streaming. The lost early material exists in production documents and not in finished animation. And the full picture of what was made of what Seth MacFarlane, and the writing rooms, and the voice cast, and the animation studios actually produced across 25 years is distributed across all of these forms in ways that make it genuinely difficult to see all at once. This video has been an attempt to see it all at once, to bring together the American institutional story and the international broadcast story, and the physical media story and the production archive story, and the legal history and the regulatory history and the creative culture that produced all of it into a single, comprehensive account of what Family Guy made and could not show you. Whether we have succeeded is for you to judge. But the attempt itself, the commitment to documenting the hidden content completely with the care and detail that it deserves, is the point. The show tried to say things that the system would not let it say. The least we can do is say clearly what those things were, and why the system stopped them, and what it means that it did. That is the full record. That is the complete archive of what Family Guy was not allowed to show you, and now you know. The weight of what almost was. Closing reflections on 25 years of hidden television. There is a quality that the best pieces of hidden content in Family Guy's history share. It is not the quality of being transgressive for its own sake. The show produced plenty of that, and most of it is not worth recovering from whatever archive it ended up in. It is the quality of taking seriously something that the institutional environment of American broadcast television has decided it does not want to take seriously. The abortion episode takes seriously the moral complexity of a question that the financial machinery of television has determined is too expensive to engage with honestly. The Weinstein episode takes seriously the specific form that casual anti-Semitism takes in American life, not in the form of organized hatred, but in the form of the well-meaning fool who has absorbed a prejudice without knowing it. And it takes that seriously in a medium that generally prefers its prejudice either condemned from a comfortable distance or never examined at all. The Road to Rhode Island airport scene took seriously the inadequacy of American airport security in a world where that inadequacy had real consequences, and it did so in the form of comedy that made the point more memorably than any editorial column of the same period. When we ask what was really lost in the suppression of this content, the answer is not simply the content itself. The content, in most cases, eventually found its way to an audience through some channel. The answer is what the content represents as an act of creative intention, the decision by a group of writers and directors and voice actors and animators to say something real and difficult and often genuinely funny about the world they lived in, through the specific medium they were working in, for the specific audience that medium had built around itself over decades. The suppression of that intention, the institutional decision that the financial risk of showing this content outweighed its value, is what was really lost. Not the content, but the relationship between the creative intention and its intended audience, which the institutional environment of American broadcast television routinely interrupted and sometimes permanently severed. What would American television look like if that relationship had been interrupted less? If the Partial Terms of Endearment episode had aired on Fox in 2010 as part of Season 8's regular run to the audience that watched Family Guy every Sunday night? If the conversation about abortion that the episode tried to start had actually been started in prime time in the context of a show that 6 or 7 million people watched every week, The answer is genuinely unknowable. Television does not run controlled experiments. But the question is worth sitting with for a moment, in the same spirit that all the best hidden content is worth sitting with, not as a fantasy of what might have been, but as a record of what was possible and what was prevented, and what that prevention tells us about the world that produced it. Family Guy tried, across 25 years, to say things that the world it operated in was not always ready to hear. Some of what it said was worth hearing. Some of what it said was poorly executed, or took the wrong angle on a real question, or conflated shock with insight in ways that produced heat without light. The archive of hidden content includes both kinds, in the same proportions that the broadcast archive does. What it does not include, what the hidden archive is definitionally without, is content that was not ambitious enough to generate the institutional response that drove it underground. The hidden content is, in a specific and meaningful sense, the most ambitious content. It is the content that tried hardest to say something that the institutional environment of American broadcast television was not prepared to let it say. Remembering that, holding that fact in mind, as you navigate the show's long history of hidden moments and buried episodes and suppressed scenes, is the most useful way to engage with the full record of what Family Guy made and could not show you, not as a catalog of scandals, not as a history of censorship in the simple pejorative sense, not as a celebration of transgression for its own sake, but as a record of creative ambition meeting institutional constraint across 25 years of production in a medium that was always more constrained than it appeared and that produced, in the space between its constraints and its intentions, some of the most interesting and most complicated documents in the history of American television comedy. That is the archive. You have now spent this long evening inside it. Take it with you. A note on sources and methodology. Everything documented in this video is drawn from the public record of the show's production and broadcast history. The primary sources include network press releases and executive public statements, court records from the Bourne Company lawsuit and the Carol Burnett lawsuit and the Art Metrano lawsuit, DVD commentaries and special features from Family Guy's Season 4 through Season 16 releases, contemporaneous news coverage from publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, Rolling Stone, Entertainment Weekly, the AV Club, the Chicago Tribune, and the BBC. The Lost Media Wiki's documentation of Family Guy's Seasons 1 to 3 deleted material, MacFarlane's own public statements and interviews, at conventions, and on social media. The Change.org petition records from the Brian Griffin death controversy. Seth MacFarlane's September 2017 Reddit AMA, in which he confirmed he had not written for the show since 2010, and the publicly available broadcast records of the show's UK and Australian runs. Where specific facts could not be verified through multiple sources, this video has noted that explicitly. The one area where this arises most clearly is the alleged existence of an X-rated production gag version of a scene from the Partial Terms of Endearment episode, which is reported anecdotally by people who claim production involvement, but has never been officially confirmed or released, and therefore cannot be definitively established as having existed. All other specific claims dates, episode titles, production codes, ratings figures, petition signature counts, court ruling dates, executive quotes, and the specific details of each content suppression decision documented here are drawn from verifiable sources in the public record of the show's history. The goal was completeness. Whether we achieved it is a question only the full archive could answer, but this is as close as the available public record permits.